Imagine a billionaire standing in front of 10,000 people, her multi-million-dollar supercar dead silent on stage. And the only person who can save her is a small-town mechanic she's never met. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his past. She just knew she was humiliated, furious, and desperate. So she pointed at him from the stage and said, into a live microphone, "Fix it. $1 million if you can." What happened next left an entire crowd speechless and changed both their lives forever. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. The alarm went off at 5:47 in the morning, same as it always did, 13 minutes before it was actually set, because Ethan Carter had never in his adult life trusted a single device to get things right on the first try. He lay still for a moment in the gray half-dark of his bedroom, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since before he moved in and that he kept meaning to patch and never did. The fan turned slowly overhead. Outside, a mockingbird was doing something loud and complicated in the mesquite tree by the fence. He reached over and silenced the phone before it could wake Noah. That was the first thing he did every morning. Not brush his teeth, not check the weather. Stop the alarm before Noah heard it, because Noah slept light and woke up slow and spent the first 20 minutes of every morning in a fog of grumpiness that Ethan found completely exhausting and entirely recognizable, because he'd been exactly the same way at 9 years old, and his own mother had told him so enough times that he believed it. He sat up. His back made a sound that it had recently started making, something between a pop and a complaint, and he pressed his knuckles into the base of his spine and stood up and walked barefoot across the cold tile floor to the kitchen. Perdido. Arizona was not a town that woke up slowly. It was more that it never fully went to sleep, not in summer anyway, when the nights stayed warm enough that people sat out on their porches past midnight and the gas station on Route 9 did steady business from truckers and insomniacs and teenagers who had nowhere better to be. But mornings were quiet. The light came in at a low angle through the kitchen window and turned everything amber, and the coffee maker, which was old and made a sound like a small animal in distress, began its cycle the moment Ethan hit the button. He stood at the counter and waited. This was the part of the day he liked best, before the noise started, before the phone rang and someone needed new brake pads or a coolant flush, or a complete transmission rebuild that they absolutely could not afford but absolutely needed. Before Noah woke up and immediately began asking questions. The kid asked questions the way some people breathed, continuously and without apparent effort, and before the heat set in and turned the garage into something you could use to bake bread. Just the coffee maker, just the light, just the mockingbird outside doing whatever it was doing. He poured a cup and drank it standing up, looking out the window at the scrubby backyard, at the rusted swing set that he'd bought secondhand when Noah was 5 and kept meaning to replace and hadn't, at the pile of lumber in the corner that was supposed to become a raised garden bed, but had so far only become a pile of lumber, at the fence where the third post from the left leaned at a 10-degree angle because the ground there was soft and he'd put it in wrong the first time and hadn't fixed it. His yard was a museum of intentions. He finished the coffee, rinsed the cup, and went to get dressed. Carter's auto was not impressive from the outside. It occupied a low concrete building on the edge of Perdido's main drag, flanked on one side by a tire shop that had been closed for 2 years and on the other by a feed store that had been there since before Ethan was born. The sign above the door was hand-painted in blue and white, slightly faded, the letters even because Ethan had measured twice and still managed to get the spacing slightly wrong, which bothered him every single morning when he pulled into the parking lot. He'd repainted it once. It came out exactly the same. Inside, the shop smelled like oil and rubber and the particular metallic cold of a space that had been closed overnight. He turned on the lights, fluorescent, one of them flickering in a way he kept meaning to fix, and went through the routine he'd done 6 days a week for the past 4 years. Check the bay doors, check the parts inventory against the day's work orders, check the coffee situation in the small office at the back, which doubled as his break room and his filing system, and sometimes, when Noah had a day off school and nowhere else to be, his son's unofficial headquarters. There was a photo on the desk in that office. He didn't look at it first thing in the morning anymore. He'd trained himself out of that, the way you train yourself out of a habit that costs too much. But it was there. A woman with dark hair and sunburned shoulders, laughing at something off camera, standing in front of a lake that didn't exist anywhere near Perdido. She was wearing a yellow dress, and she looked like she had no idea how beautiful she was, which had always been one of the things he loved most about her. Her name had been Claire. He turned on the computer, pulled up the work orders, and got to it. By 9 in the morning, he had already rebuilt a carburetor, diagnosed a misfire on a 2019 F-150 that turned out to be a cracked intake manifold, and argued patiently but firmly with a woman named Donna Garza about whether she actually needed new rotors or just new pads. "The rotors are fine, Donna," the guy at Pep Boys said. "I know what the guy at Pep Boys said. I'm telling you, the rotors have got at least another 18 months on them. You need pads. That's it." Donna was 63 years old and had been coming to Carter's since before Ethan owned it, back when it was Hicks Auto and smelled even worse than it did now. She had short gray hair and reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck, and a way of folding her arms that communicated deep skepticism without requiring words. "I just don't want to have to come back in 6 months," she said. "If the rotors need replacing in 6 months, I'll do it for free." She unfolded her arms slightly. "In writing? Donna, I've been doing your car for 4 years. Have I ever told you something needed replacing when it didn't?" She thought about it. The alternator. The alternator was failing. It could have gone another 3 weeks, I'll give you that. But it was going. She picked up her keys from the counter and looked at him over the tops of her glasses. "Fine, but I'm remembering what you said." "I know you are." She left. Marcus Webb, Ethan's only full-time employee and the closest thing he had to a best friend, emerged from under a Jeep Cherokee and looked at him with the expression of someone who had heard that entire conversation. "You give that free rotor guarantee to everybody?" Marcus asked. "Just the ones who've been coming here long enough to know I'm honest. That's either a great business model or a terrible one. Probably both." Marcus was 26, built like someone who'd played college ball and hadn't entirely stopped training, and possessed of a mechanical intuition that Ethan had recognized immediately when he hired him 2 years ago. He learned fast, and he worked hard, and he complained just enough to be human, which Ethan appreciated. He'd had an assistant before Marcus who never complained about anything, and it had made Ethan deeply uncomfortable. "What's the situation with the Tacoma?" Ethan asked. "Fuel pump's shot." "I was right." "I know you were right. I just needed to check the filter first before we ordered the pump." "Which I also said." "And I agreed with you." Marcus slid back under the Jeep. "I'm just saying, for the record." "Noted, for the record." It was a Tuesday in late October, warm but not scorching, and the shop was busy but not overwhelming. By 11:30, Ethan had eaten half a granola bar, drank 2 more cups of coffee, and successfully not thought about the thing he'd been not thinking about since he saw the banner. The Hartwell Automotive banner. Strung up across Main Street between the hardware store and the old movie theater, announcing that on Thursday, 2 days from now, Perdido, Arizona would be the host of the Vortex X1 regional tour stop. He'd seen it Monday morning. He'd looked at it for about 4 seconds, registered what it said, and decided immediately that he had zero interest in attending. Then he'd gone to work and not thought about it. He was doing a very good job of not thinking about it. Noah came by after school at 3:15, backpack over one shoulder, sneakers untied because he was physically incapable of remembering to tie them, carrying a flyer that someone had apparently handed out at school. "Dad," he said, the way 9-year-olds say things, with the full weight of the world compressed into one syllable. Ethan was elbow deep in the engine bay of a Honda Accord and didn't turn around. "Shoes." "What?" "Tie your shoes." The sound of a backpack being dropped. The sound of labored crouching. The sound of what was apparently a deeply complicated shoe-tying operation. "Dad." "Yeah." "Are you going to the car show?" He pulled a hand out of the engine and reached for a rag. "No." "Why not?" "Because I have work to do." "It's on Thursday." "I know when it is." Marcus said he'd watch the shop. Ethan turned around. Marcus was leaning against the far wall with an expression of elaborate innocence that suggested he had absolutely been talking to Noah about this. "Did he?" Ethan said. "I might have mentioned it," Marcus said to the ceiling. Noah held up the flyer. It had a photograph of the Vortex X1 on it. All curves and angles, matte black with red brake calipers visible through the spokes of the wheels. It was objectively a beautiful piece of engineering, and Ethan was aware of this in the distant, clinical way that he was aware of many things he had decided not to care about. "It's the fastest production car in North America," Noah said. "It goes 0 to 60 in 2.3 seconds. 2.3, Dad. That's like—" He appeared to search for an appropriate comparison. "That's faster than anything." "I'm aware. You work on cars." "I fix cars. That's different." Noah frowned. He had Claire's eyes, dark brown, with a slight downward tilt at the corners that made him look thoughtful, even when he was just deciding what he wanted for dinner. He had Ethan's stubbornness, which was less convenient. "We never do anything," Noah said. "That's not true. We went to the grocery store on Saturday. And the week before that we went to the canyon. That was 6 weeks ago." Ethan looked at his son. Noah was staring back at him with the particular expression of a kid who knew he was making a solid point and was giving the adult time to acknowledge it. "It's just a marketing thing," Ethan said. "They drive the car around, people take pictures, company gets publicity. That's all it is." "So? So it's not—" He stopped. "It's not really our thing, is what I mean. How do you know if we've never gone?" From the back of the shop, Marcus made a sound that could have been a cough and was almost certainly a laugh. Ethan took a breath. "Let me think about it." Noah knew that "let me think about it" was not a no. He picked up his backpack and headed toward the office in the back, where there was a beanbag chair and an old tablet that he used for homework, or more accurately, for whatever was on YouTube instead of homework. "You're going to regret it if you don't go," Noah said over his shoulder. "Maybe. Probably." He disappeared into the office. Ethan turned back to the Honda. "You're going," Marcus said. "I haven't decided." "You made the face." "I don't have a face." "The face where you know something's the right thing to do and you're annoyed about it. You made it." Ethan didn't say anything. He put his hand back into the engine. "Thursday," Marcus said. "I'll open up. Go with your kid. Watch the fancy car. Come back." Ethan worked in silence for a moment. "Fine," he said. "Stop talking about it." The wheels of the Hartwell Automotive G6 touched down at Flagstaff Pulliam Airport at 11:22 in the morning, 40 minutes ahead of schedule, because Olivia Hartwell had a standing policy that any flight delay was unacceptable, and her flight crew had long since internalized this to the point where they scheduled phantom buffer time into every trip. She was on the phone before the plane stopped moving. "Tell me about Perdido," she said. On the other end, her head of logistics, a compact and perpetually caffeinated man named Derek Sauce, pulled up the file. Population around 9,000. Median income slightly below state average. Tourism picks up in fall because of the canyon access, but it's basically a pass-through town. We're the biggest event they've had in... He paused. Possibly ever. Good. The venue is the town square. We've got the stage and barrier setup done, sound system in, lighting rig goes up tonight. Local press has been running coverage all week. Estimated crowd for Thursday is somewhere between 8 and 12,000. I want 12. Olivia, I want 12,000 people at that event, Derek. Figure it out. She ended the call and looked out the window as the plane taxied to a stop. The mountains were visible in the distance, rust-colored and enormous, and the sky above them was the particular blue that you only got at altitude, deep and cloudless and a little brutal. She was 30 years old and she had not taken a vacation in 4 years. She thought about this sometimes, briefly, the way you think about a light that needs replacing. You're aware of it, you make a mental note, and then something more pressing comes up and the note gets buried under other notes. Hartwell Automotive was not her father's company, though people sometimes said so in a way that implied it was. Her father, Raymond Hartwell, had built a regional dealership network in the 80s that had been successful in the specific, unspectacular way of many regional businesses. Profitable, stable, unglamorous. Olivia had taken over at 24 after his health declined, and in 6 years had turned it into something that bore almost no resemblance to what it had been. She'd pushed into manufacturing. She'd cultivated relationships with engineers and designers, that others in the industry had written off as too experimental. She'd bet on the Vortex X1 when every financial advisor in her orbit told her not to. The Vortex X1, as of this morning's press coverage, was described variously as the most significant development in American performance automotive in a decade, a genuine technological leap, and the car that proves Hartwell Automotive has arrived. She did not find this particularly satisfying, which she recognized was a problem, but it was a problem she'd deal with later. What she found satisfying was the tour. The physical, undeniable, in-person evidence that the car existed, that it worked, that it had been worth every argument and every late night and every room full of people telling her she was wrong. 12 cities, 10 weeks. The Vortex X1 on a stage in front of tens of thousands of people. Perdido was stop number 7. Her assistant, a young woman named Priya, who handled Olivia's schedule with the focused intensity of an air traffic controller, met her at the bottom of the stairs. "Car's ready, hotel in Flagstaff. We drive to Perdido tomorrow morning for setup review." "I want to do the setup review tonight." Priya did not blink. "I'll push dinner. Push it to 7, and I need the technical report from the Vortex team." "Already in your folder." Olivia started walking. "And get me a coffee that actually tastes like coffee. That thing on the plane was from the same supplier you approved in January." "Then they've changed something. Get me a different one." "There's a place in Flagstaff that's supposed to be—" "I don't need it to be supposed to be good. I need it to be good." Priya made a note on her tablet without comment, which was one of the things Olivia appreciated most about her. The SUV waiting on the tarmac was black, of course. Hartwell Automotive vehicles, all of them. She slid into the back seat and opened the technical folder while the mountain slid past the windows and the road began its descent toward the high desert. The Vortex X1 specifications were something she had memorized 3 years ago and still checked every time there was a new version of the document, out of habit or anxiety or something she didn't have a word for. Twin turbocharged V8, 840 horsepower. Adaptive suspension system that the engineering team called the A-spine, which could adjust to road conditions in real time, compensating for surface irregularities in under 30 milliseconds. Carbon fiber monocoque chassis. 0 to 60 in 2.3 seconds. She knew every number. She could not, however, explain to you the specific mechanical genius that had made the original engine concept work, because she was not an engineer. She was a businesswoman who understood engineering well enough to hire the right engineers, and she had learned, sometimes the hard way, that there was a meaningful difference between those two things. The man who had originally conceived the engine architecture that the Vortex X1 was built on had been named, according to her company's early development records, Dr. James Harmon. Harmon had left the prototype project before it reached production stage, replaced by a team that Olivia had assembled herself. She'd thought of him occasionally over the years, the way you think of a footnote, but the finished car bore little surface resemblance to the original concept, and her engineering team had evolved the design so substantially that the original work was more prologue than foundation, or so she'd been told. She closed the folder and looked out the window. The desert stretched out flat and rust-red and enormous, and somewhere out there beyond the mountains and the highway and the small towns with their water towers and their Main Street banners, Perdido was getting ready for Thursday. She didn't know yet what Thursday would cost her. Nobody did. Testom. Wednesday passed the way Wednesdays do. Too fast when you need time, and too slow when you need something to happen. Ethan told Noah they were going to the event. Noah received this information with the specific joy of a child who has won an argument he wasn't entirely sure he would win, not crowing, just quietly satisfied, as if the universe had validated his position. He spent the evening reading everything he could find about the Vortex X1 online, and periodically reading facts aloud to Ethan, who was trying to read and responding with a series of noises that he hoped conveyed sufficient interest. "The A-spine suspension has 47 individual adjustment points," Noah said. That's more than any production car ever made." "Dad, are you actually listening?" 47, A-spine, production car. Noah looked at him. That was impressive. "I have skills." "What's your favorite thing about the Vortex X1? Ethan lowered his book. His son was sitting cross-legged on the couch with the tablet in his lap, watching him with genuine curiosity, and it occurred to Ethan, not for the first time, not for the 100th time, that Noah had no idea. That to Noah, his father was simply a mechanic in a small Arizona town who was good at fixing things. A quiet man who made breakfast on Sundays and coached his little league team for one season before the schedule got too complicated, and who never talked about the years before Perdido. The engine architecture, Ethan said. Noah looked slightly surprised. You know about it? A little. What do you know? Go to sleep. We have an early morning Thursday. Noah looked like he wanted to push further, then decided not to. He was 9, but he was perceptive, and he'd learned over years of living with Ethan to recognize certain conversational walls. Okay, he said. Night. Night, bud. After Noah went to his room, Ethan sat in the quiet for a while. The TV was off. The mockingbird had finally gone quiet. The house ticked and settled the way old houses do, all its small movements, the creak of the floor joists, the hiss of the refrigerator, as familiar as breathing. He thought about the engine. Not because he wanted to, more because he couldn't help it, the way you can't help noticing when a song comes on that you used to love, even when you've spent years teaching yourself not to listen. He'd been 26 when he worked on the original concept, not Dr. Harmon's concept. Harmon had been the team lead, the one who got the credit, the one whose name was in the documents. But Ethan had been the one who'd solved the thermal expansion problem that was killing the early prototypes, sitting alone at a drafting table at 2 a.m. with cold coffee and a headache, working through equations until something clicked. He'd been the one who'd figured out the firing sequence modification that made the power delivery smooth instead of violent, that made it feel like something engineered by hand instead of assembled by algorithm. He'd been 26, and he'd been proud of it in the way of someone who doesn't yet understand how quickly things can change. Then Claire got sick, and then everything else stopped mattering in the way it used to. He poured himself a glass of water, drank it standing at the kitchen sink, and went to bed. The crowd started gathering early. By 9 a.m, 2 hours before the event was scheduled to start, people were already staking out spots along the barrier in Perdido's town square, folding chairs, strollers, a group of older men who'd clearly decided this was as good an excuse as any to stand around together and talk. The high school had apparently let students sign up to volunteer, which meant that clusters of teenagers in matching orange vests were everywhere, holding clipboards they weren't sure what to do with. The Vortex X1 sat on a raised platform at the center of it all, under a matte black cover, flanked by 2 Hartwell automotive flags. Lighting rigs surrounded it. Sound equipment occupied one side of the square. A big screen behind the stage displayed a slow-rolling reel of the car from various angles. The engineering process, the design team, clips of the car on a test track. Ethan and Noah arrived at 10:30 and found a spot about 30 feet back from the barrier, which Noah immediately began working to improve by edging forward whenever a gap opened up. Stop moving, Ethan said. I'm not moving. You are moving. You've moved 15 feet since we got here. People were letting me through. Those people didn't know they were letting you through. Noah looked at him. I'm 9. That's not actually a defense. They ended up 8 feet from the barrier, which Noah seemed to accept as a reasonable outcome. The crowd was dense around them. Families, couples, a lot of people who clearly knew each other, the small-town density of a place where most people's lives overlapped at multiple points. Ethan recognized faces. The Garza family was 3 spots to his left. One of the volunteer parents from Noah's Little League team was somewhere behind him. The guy who ran the hardware store was standing with his arms folded, looking simultaneously skeptical and entertained. This is a lot of people, Noah said. Yeah. For Perdido, I mean. Yeah. Noah craned his neck toward the stage. Do you think she'll be here? Hartwell? It's her tour, probably. Have you ever seen her, like, in person? No. She's really young to be a billionaire. She's 30. How do you know how old she is? Ethan paused. It was in the news when the car was announced. Noah seemed to accept this. He went back to studying the covered car on the platform with the focused attention he reserved for things he found genuinely interesting, which was not everything, but when it hit completely. The sound system crackled. A voice, smooth, professional, timed for maximum excitement, began walking the crowd through what they were about to witness. The tour history, the engineering achievements, the numbers that made the Vortex X1 the fastest, most sophisticated production car in North America. And then a different voice came through the speakers. Clearer. No performative warmth, just directness. Thank you all for being here. Olivia Hartwell walked onto the stage wearing a charcoal blazer and no jewelry and an expression that said she was here to work, not to be charming. She was not tall, but she carried herself like someone who'd never once considered that height was a relevant variable. I want to show you something, she said, and her voice on the speakers was level and clean. Not tell you about it. Not have someone else describe it to you. I want to show you. She nodded to someone off stage. Two technicians in Hartwell uniforms moved to the sides of the platform and reached for the cover. The crowd went quiet without being asked to. The cover came away. The Vortex X1 was extraordinary. There was really no other word for it. Even Ethan, who had spent years deciding not to care, felt the thing that you feel when engineering and aesthetics come together in a way that can't be argued with. It was low and wide, and the matte black finish absorbed the October light in a way that made it look like it was already moving. The proportions were exact in the way that exact things very rarely are. Noah made a sound beside him that was not quite a word. I know, Ethan said quietly. Olivia stepped off the stage and into the driver's seat with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, which she probably had. The crowd pressed forward, the cameras tracked her. The big screen split between a live feed of the car and a diagram of the engine firing sequence, because Hartwell Automotive had clearly thought very hard about how to make a crowd of mixed technical knowledge feel included. The engine turned over. It did not catch. There was a half-second of confusion, the kind of silence that happens when something unexpected occurs, and nobody's sure yet how to classify it. Olivia tried the ignition again. The starter motor engaged, the engine turned, and then nothing. No catch, no roar. She tried a third time. From 30 feet away through the sound system and the ambient noise of a confused crowd, Ethan heard it. Not the silence. The sound before the silence. The specific particular way the engine was turning that was different from how it should turn. A rhythm that was slightly off. A timing that was... He knew that sound. He'd heard it in his head for years. In the abstract way you remember something you built with your hands, and he knew immediately, in the way that people who've spent enough time with engines develop a kind of instinct, what was wrong. Not exactly, not specifically, but the shape of it. Dad, Noah said, something's wrong with the car. Yeah. Can you tell what it is? Ethan didn't answer. On the stage, Olivia Hartwell climbed out of the car with an expression that gave away almost nothing. Controlled, still, the face of someone who was furious and refusing to let it show, and spoke quietly to a man in a suit who immediately got on a radio. The crowd murmured. The sound system went quiet. 3 technicians appeared from somewhere with diagnostic equipment, moving quickly and with the focused energy of people who were very aware that thousands of people were watching them. Ethan watched. He watched the lead technician connect the diagnostic tool to the port. He watched the readout appear on a tablet. He couldn't see the screen from where he stood, but he could see the technician's face, and the face told him enough. He watched 2 more engineers arrive and confer with the first one, pointing at the engine compartment from different angles, and he watched the body language of that conversation shift from confident to uncertain. They don't know what it is, Marcus would have said if Marcus had been there. Marcus would have been right. Noah tugged on his sleeve. Can you tell from here? Maybe. What do you think it is? I don't know for sure. That was true, but the shape of it, the rhythm of what he'd heard, the specific way the starter was engaging, there was a problem in the firing sequence, something in the timing that was creating a cascade fault. The A-spine suspension modifications that had been made since the original design. He'd read about them in an article 2 years ago, read them the way he read about a lot of things he told himself he wasn't interested in. There was an interaction between the adaptive system and the engine management computer that hadn't existed in the original architecture. And if something had gone wrong in that interaction during the startup sequence, he stopped himself. He was standing in a crowd in Perdido, Arizona, watching people who were paid far more than he would ever be paid try to solve a problem with a car he hadn't worked on in 6 years and wasn't supposed to know anything about. He was a mechanic. He fixed cars. He turned to Noah. "You want something to drink? I saw a water stand back there." Noah stared at him. "Dad, the car is broken." "Yeah, their engineers are handling it." "You know what's wrong." "I have a guess." "A good guess?" Ethan looked at the stage. The engineers were on their second diagnostic cycle. Olivia Hartwell was standing at the side of the platform with her arms at her sides, not folded, the arms of someone who was controlling themselves very carefully, talking on a phone. The crowd had gone from confused to restless. "A pretty good guess," he said. Noah looked at him with those dark eyes. "So why aren't you doing anything?" he asked. It was the kind of question that 9-year-olds ask because they don't yet understand the complicated machinery of adult decisions, the weight of history, the geometry of who you used to be and who you've decided to be instead. They just see a problem and a person who might be able to fix it and wonder why those two things aren't already connected. Ethan opened his mouth. From the stage, a voice cut through the crowd noise. "Is there anyone here? Anyone who might have relevant expertise with this engine system?" It was Olivia Hartwell, on the microphone, looking out at the crowd with the expression of someone who had just made a decision that cost her something. The crowd went quiet. "I'm asking seriously. My team is working on it. But if anyone has direct experience with this class of engine architecture, twin-turbo 5.8 with adaptive management systems, I'd like to speak with you." Silence. Noah looked at his father. Ethan looked at the stage. There was a woman 2 people to his left who turned to her husband and said, in a carrying whisper, "She means like a mechanic? Like someone from around here?" Her husband shrugged. "Doubt it. Eat." Noah grabbed his father's arm. "Dad," he said. "Noah." "Dad." Ethan looked at his son, at the dark eyes that were so much like Claire's that sometimes he couldn't look at them directly because the resemblance was too close to a wound. At the expression on his face that was not a child's expression. It was something older, something that understood, even at 9, that there were moments you either stepped through or you didn't, and that the ones you didn't step through stayed with you. "Please," Noah said, quietly, just to him. Ethan stood still for one more second, then he raised his hand, and the world for a moment went extremely still. People near him turned. A volunteer in an orange vest saw the raised hand and looked uncertain. On stage, someone pointed. Olivia Hartwell's gaze tracked across the crowd and found him. A man in a flannel shirt and work jeans, standing with his hand in the air, unremarkable in every way that surfaces allow you to judge. She leaned into the microphone. "Sir," she said, "come forward." Ethan lowered his hand. "Stay right here," he told Noah. "Are you kidding me? I'm coming right here." He moved through the crowd, which parted with the specific curiosity of people watching something unfold that they don't yet understand, and walked toward the stage and the broken car and the billionaire who had no idea who she was looking at. He would think about it later, what it felt like walking up to that platform with cameras turning to track him and thousands of eyes following. He would think about it and come to the conclusion that it felt mostly like nothing, which was strange because he'd expected it to feel like something significant, some swell of emotion or surge of nerves. But what he mostly felt was the thing he felt when he stood in front of an engine that needed figuring out. Focused. That was all. Just the problem, and his hands, and the particular narrow clarity of knowing what you're looking at. He introduced himself to Olivia Hartwell by his first name, because that's how he introduced himself to everyone. She looked at him. Really looked at him, the way someone does when they're trying to quickly assess a situation they're not sure about, and said, "Do you have mechanical experience with this system?" "Some," he said. "Define some." He didn't answer that. He looked at the car. "Can I get under the hood?" A beat. A look that lasted just a second too long, calculating. "Yes," she said. He got under the hood. And what happened next, what he found and what it meant, and why the sound of that engine catching on the third attempt would stay with people in Perdido for years. That's a different part of the story. But it started here, in a crowd, with a 9-year-old's hand on his sleeve and a question he couldn't argue with. "Why aren't you doing anything?" The engineers saw him before Olivia did. That was the thing nobody talked about later, how the 3 Hartwell technicians working the diagnostic on the Vortex X1 registered his approach in the way that people with credentials register the uncredentialed. A quick glance, a slight tightening around the eyes, and then a return to whatever they were doing that communicated, without words, that this particular situation was being handled by people who knew what they were doing, and that the situation did not require additional input from the general public. The lead technician's name was Garrett Foss. He was 34, had a master's degree in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech, and had been with Hartwell Automotive for 3 years. He was good at his job, genuinely good, not just credentialed and competent good. And the fact that the Vortex X1 had failed to start in front of what was now approximately 11,000 people was causing him a very specific kind of distress that lived somewhere between professional panic and personal shame. He'd run 2 diagnostic cycles. The readout was giving him an engine management fault code, E7-14, that he recognized in the abstract, the way you recognize a word in a language you've studied but don't speak fluently. It meant something in the interface between the adaptive suspension controller and the engine ignition sequence. It was supposed to be a safety interlock. It was not supposed to trigger under these conditions. It had never triggered under these conditions, not in 2 years of testing, not in 6 prior tour stops. The problem was, he knew what the code meant in the same way you can know what a closed door means without knowing what's on the other side of it. So when Ethan Carter walked up to the side of the platform wearing work jeans and a flannel shirt with a small grease stain near the second button, Garrett Foss looked at him the way the engineers looked at him, which was to say, not particularly. "Sir, this area is restricted to Hartwell personnel." "I know," Ethan said. He wasn't talking to Fossey. He was looking at the car. "Can I get a look at the diagnostic readout?" Fossey turned to face him fully. "Who are you?" "Local mechanic." "This isn't a standard vehicle, sir. The engine system requires specialized knowledge." "Yeah." Ethan looked at him for the first time. "I'm aware. Can I see the readout?" Olivia had come up behind Fossey during this exchange, and she said, "Let him see it," in a tone that closed the conversation. Fossey turned and handed over the tablet with the expression of a man who had very specific feelings about this development and had decided, correctly, that expressing them was not his best option right now. Ethan looked at the readout. He looked at it the way Ethan looked at most things, without urgency, steadily, the way someone looks when they're not performing looking but actually doing it. He scrolled back through the fault log. He looked at the timestamp sequence. "How many times did you try to start it?" he asked. 3, Olivia said. 2 additional during the diagnostic cycle. 5 total. "Yes." He handed the tablet back to Fossey. "Pop the hood." Fossey looked at Olivia. Olivia nodded. Fossey reached into the cabin through the driver's window and pulled the release, and the hood rose with the soft hydraulic ease of something engineered to feel effortless. Ethan put both hands on the edge of the engine bay and leaned in. He was quiet for a while. The crowd noise was a low, restless murmur beyond the barrier. Someone had cut the music, which made the silence around the platform feel larger than it actually was. A camera operator from the local news station had worked his way to the side of the stage and was shooting, and the footage, Ethan would find out later, was already being shared in real time by people in the crowd who had been filming on their phones. A man in a flannel shirt looking at a dead supercar while 11,000 people waited. It wasn't cinematic. It was just a man looking at an engine. "There's a thermal expansion issue in the A-spine controller housing," Ethan said. Not to anyone in particular. More like he was thinking out loud, which was something he did when he was working, a habit he'd had since he was an apprentice. The housing heated up during transport, probably sitting in the trailer for... How long were you in transit yesterday? Fossey blinked. About 6 hours. Air-conditioned trailer? Standard temperature control. What's standard? A pause. 68? That's not enough for the controller housing during a 6-hour haul in October desert heat. The housing expanded, fractionally, but enough to shift the connection tolerance on the A7 sensor. He straightened up. When you tried to start it 5 times in sequence, you were triggering the safety interlock because the A7 is reading outside its calibration window. The car thinks something's wrong with the suspension calibration, so it won't allow ignition. Silence. Garrett Fossey was staring at him with an expression that had moved through several phases rapidly and settled on something that was not quite belief and not quite disbelief, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between them. That's... Fossey started. The sensor needs to be reset to its calibration baseline. You'll need to clear the fault log, physically unseat and reseat the A7 connector. Not replace it, just reseat it. And then run a manual suspension calibration cycle before you attempt ignition again. Ethan looked into the engine bay one more time. The housing will contract back to tolerance once the day cools, but for right now, you need to reset and recalibrate. He stepped back. That's my guess, he said. Could be wrong. He was not wrong, and some part of the people standing close enough to hear him seemed to understand this, because the silence that followed was a different quality than the restless silence of before. It was the silence of a room where something has just shifted. Garrett Fossey looked at his tablet. He pulled up the A7 sensor readout, which he had looked at twice already. And this time, with the framework Ethan had just given him, the numbers arranged themselves into a pattern that he had not seen before because he hadn't known to look for it. Oh, Fossey said quietly, in the tone of someone who has just found their keys in the last place they looked and is feeling very specific emotions about the fact that they are in that place. Olivia had been watching Ethan the entire time. She was not someone who watched people the way most people watch people, so passively, intermittently, attention drifting. She watched the way she did everything, which was completely. She had watched him lean over the engine bay, watched his hands move, not touching anything yet, just reading the geometry of the system, watched his face in the moment he found the thing he was looking for, the slight change in the set of his jaw, the way he went still. She had hired engineers for a decade. She knew what someone looked like when they actually understood something versus when they were performing understanding. The difference was not subtle once you'd seen it enough. Do it, she said to Fossey. Everything he said, in that order. Fossey was already moving. Ethan stepped back further and moved out of the way because there were now 3 engineers around the engine bay, and his part of this, or what he'd thought was his part, seemed to be done. He looked for Noah in the crowd. He could see him at the barrier, short enough that he was half hidden behind the adults in front, craning up on his toes to see. He raised a hand. Noah saw it and raised both of his. Mr. Carter. He turned. Olivia Hartwell was standing 3 feet away from him, and up close she was. He noted this the way he noted most things, practically, younger looking than her photographs, and more tired, with a kind of tension in her face that she was working to keep out of her voice. You know his name? One of the nearby crew said to someone else. Ethan didn't address that. Ms. Hartwell, he said. How do you know the A-spine system? I've read about it. Mechanics in Perdido, Arizona don't read about proprietary adaptive suspension architectures. Most don't, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. It was a direct look, the kind that most people found uncomfortable, and that Ethan, who had spent years learning to feel comfortable with uncomfortable things, met without difficulty. Are you going to tell me who you are? She asked. I told you, local mechanic. That's not an answer. It's the accurate one. Something moved in her expression. Not quite irritation, not quite curiosity. Something between them. If this works, she said, we'll talk about what that conversation looks like. Sure, Ethan said in the tone of someone who is not thinking about that conversation at all, but is too polite to say so. He moved back from the platform and found a spot at the barrier that a security volunteer vacated for him, though he hadn't asked them to. From there, he could see into the engine bay where Fossey and his team were working through the procedure in the order Ethan had laid out. Methodical, careful, not rushing, which Ethan appreciated. You could tell a lot about an engineer by whether they rushed when they were nervous. They didn't rush. It took 11 minutes. He timed it without meaning to, the way he timed things in the shop, automatically by feel, a clock in his head that had been running since the first time a supervisor had told him that in this industry, time was always someone's money. At the 11-minute mark, Fosse leaned into the driver's window, and the crowd, which had been murmuring steadily, people speculating about what was happening, phones in the air, 1,000 small conversations about what was wrong with the car and who the man in the flannel shirt was, went quiet again. The ignition engaged. The engine turned. It caught on the first attempt. The sound of a Vortex X1 engine coming to life was something that the people in that square had not heard before, and the description of it that Ethan would give later, if pressed, which he generally wasn't because he didn't volunteer information about things like this, was that it sounded exactly right. Not impressive in the theatrical sense, just right. The harmonics of a well-engineered system doing precisely what it was designed to do, every component in its correct relationship to every other component, the whole thing running the way things run when they're built correctly. The crowd did not go quiet when it caught. The crowd made the noise that crowds make when 11,000 people are surprised simultaneously, which is not exactly cheering and not exactly a gasp, but something that combines elements of both. A collective release that has more to do with relief than excitement. The people near Ethan, strangers mostly, people he knew by sight but not by name, turned to him with expressions that ranged from amazed to delighted. The woman to his left grabbed his arm. "That was you," she said, in the tone of a statement rather than a question. "You told them what to do." "They did it," Ethan said, "but you told them." He didn't answer that. He was looking at Noah, who was on the other side of the barrier now. Somehow, in the 11 minutes of the repair, his son had migrated from his designated spot to within about 10 feet of the stage, and Ethan made a mental note to ask him later how he'd managed that, though he already suspected the answer involved being small and moving slowly and hoping nobody noticed. Noah was grinning, full, unguarded, the kind of grin that doesn't have any self-consciousness in it yet, because you're 9 and haven't learned to worry about what your face does. He was looking at his father and grinning, and it was the kind of thing that Ethan generally tried not to think about too hard because the feelings it produced were more than he knew what to do with in public. He gave Noah a small nod. Noah punched the air. From the stage, Olivia Hartwell climbed into the driver's seat of the Vortex X1 for the second time that morning, and this time, when she turned the key, the engine was already running, and she took it once around the closed course they'd set up in the square, a tight loop, barely enough room to get the car above 30 miles an hour. And even at 30 miles an hour, even in a closed loop in a small Arizona town, the Vortex X1 sounded like exactly what it was. The crowd cheered fully, properly, the way they'd been ready to cheer from the beginning. Ethan watched her drive it. He watched the way the adaptive suspension absorbed the imperfect surface of the square's paving stones, watched the body stay level through the turns, watched the car behave the way he'd known, in the abstract and the specific, that it could behave. And he felt something that he didn't have an easy word for. Not pride exactly, not nostalgia, something quieter than either of those. The feeling of watching something you helped make, from very far away, still working the way you'd intended. Then it was over, and the crowd was cheering, and Olivia climbed out, and the event moved forward into its scripted second act. The technical presentation, the Q&A, the photographs, and Ethan began working his way back through the crowd toward Noah. He didn't make it. A hand on his shoulder, not aggressive, just there, and a young woman in a Hartwell automotive badge, with the crisp energy of someone whose job description included making sure people ended up where they were supposed to be. "Mr. Carter, Ms. Hartwell would like to speak with you." "I'm trying to get to my son." "He's welcome to come." He looked across the crowd. Noah had spotted the exchange and was already weaving through toward him with the targeted efficiency of a child who understood that something interesting was happening and intended to be part of it. "Fine," Ethan said. Quiet. They were taken to a space behind the stage, not quite backstage in the theatrical sense, more of a tented area with folding tables and equipment cases and the particular atmosphere of an event that's running on adrenaline and logistics. Priya was there, tablet in hand, talking quietly into a headset. Garrett Fosse was there, sitting at one of the folding tables, looking at his diagnostic tablet with the focused attention of someone who was trying very hard not to think about the last 40 minutes. Ethan and Noah sat in 2 folding chairs that the Hartwell staffer set up for them with the slightly awkward efficiency of someone improvising. Noah looked at everything with the calm, comprehensive attention of a kid cataloging a new environment. He didn't say anything, which was unusual enough that Ethan noticed it. Olivia arrived 4 minutes later. She'd changed, or rather, she'd put a different jacket over the same shirt, which suggested she'd made some kind of concession to formality without committing to it. She was carrying nothing, which Ethan had come to understand meant she was talking off record, or at least not on the schedule. She sat down across from them and looked at Noah first. "You're his son?" "Yes, ma'am," Noah said. "How old?" 9. "Do you work on cars too?" "Not yet. My dad says I can start learning when I'm 12. 11, Ethan said without looking up from his hands. Noah turned to stare at him. "You said 12. "I said we'd talk about it at 12. I didn't say 12 was the start date." Noah appeared to be filing this distinction away for future use. Olivia watched this exchange with the expression of someone who is recalibrating what kind of conversation they're in. Then she looked at Ethan. "I want to understand what happened out there," she said. "Your team handled it," Ethan said. "I just pointed them in the right direction." "That's a generous description of what occurred. My team had been working for 20 minutes without identifying the fault. You identified it in about 3. She leaned forward slightly. "I need to know how." I recognized the sound the starter was making. The timing was off in a way that told me the engine management was blocking ignition rather than failing to engage. That narrowed it to an interlock issue. The A7 sensor was the most likely candidate given the transit conditions and the heat. "How do you know about the A7 sensor?" A pause. Not a long one. Just the length of time it takes to decide how much to say. "I've followed the development of this system for a while," he said. "How long is a while?" "Long enough." Olivia sat back. She had a way of sitting that was very still, son. Not tense, not relaxed, just controlled, like someone who'd learned a long time ago that stillness communicated authority in rooms where noise was being made all around you. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Ethan." She tried the first name like she was testing whether it fit the situation. "My engineers, who are not, by any measure, unqualified, could not diagnose what you diagnosed in 3 minutes. So I need you to help me understand whether you were lucky or whether you have some knowledge of the system that goes beyond following the development from a distance." Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Noah. Noah was watching him with those eyes. "I'm not ready to have that conversation," Ethan said to Olivia. Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, maybe. People didn't often tell her they weren't ready. "Excuse me? I helped you fix your car. That's what I came up here for. The conversation you're asking about is a different thing." "Are you—" She stopped. "Are you negotiating with me right now?" "No, I'm just saying I'd rather not get into my background today. In front of your son." It wasn't a question, and the accuracy of it, the fact that she'd seen it that fast, the specific discomfort he had about having this conversation in front of a 9-year-old who didn't know the shape of the life his father had left behind, made Ethan go quiet for a second in a way he didn't particularly enjoy. "Yeah," he said. "In front of my son." Olivia looked at him for a moment that stretched out past comfortable. Then she nodded. A short, clean nod, the kind that closes a subject rather than opening it. "All right," she said. "We'll leave it, for now." Noah, who had been absorbing this entire exchange with the focused silence of a child who understands that the adults are discussing something that matters and that interrupting is not an option, chose this moment to speak. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, "your car is really incredible." She turned to him, and something in her expression changed in a way that was harder to read than her professional face, less controlled, more genuine. "Thank you. The 0 to 60 number is the fastest in North America, but the thing I actually think is coolest is the A-spine, because it's not just about speed, it's about control. Most fast cars are fast and then hard to drive. The Vortex is fast and still. My dad says..." He stopped. Ethan had not moved, but something about him had shifted, and Noah, who understood his father the way children understand the one adult, they've studied their whole lives, felt it. "My dad says the best engineering is when the car does what the driver intends, not what the driver commands," Noah finished more carefully. There's a difference. Olivia Hartwell looked at the boy and then at the man, and she was quiet for a moment in the way of someone adding things up. That's a very precise way to describe what the A-spine is supposed to do, she said to Noah, though she was looking at Ethan. I know, Noah said. Ethan stood up. We should probably get back. Marcus is covering the shop. Of course. Olivia stood too and offered her hand, and Ethan shook it. Her grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who'd done a lot of them and stopped thinking about what they communicated. Thank you for what you did today. Seriously, you salvaged something that would have been, she paused, searching, a significant problem. I know what it would have been, Ethan said, not unkindly. She walked them out to the edge of the tented area, and just before they stepped back into the noise of the event, the crowd was still out there. The Vortex X1 was being photographed from every conceivable angle. The Hartwell brand ambassadors were handing out merchandise bags. She said, without preamble, "You'll hear from me." Ethan glanced back. "You don't have my number. I'll find it." He considered pointing out that this was the kind of thing that sounded less reassuring than she probably intended, but decided against it. Instead, he nodded, took Noah by the shoulder, and walked back into the crowd. She's going to call you, Noah said, with the confidence of someone stating a fact. Probably. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. That means you're going to think about it and not tell me. That means I don't know yet. Noah looked up at him as they moved through the thinning crowd. You knew what was wrong with that car before anyone else did. You knew it from the sound. How? Experience. What kind of experience? Ethan stopped and crouched down so he was at eye level with his son, which he still did sometimes, less often than when Noah was younger, but for certain conversations it mattered. The crowd moved around them, nobody paying attention, the event dissolving into the ordinary noise of people leaving and vendors packing up. There are parts of my life that happened before you, Ethan said, before Perdido. Things I did, places I worked, some of it was, I was good at some things. Before. Noah was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. What happened to those things? Life happened. Other things became more important. Like me? Like a lot of things, including you. Yeah. Noah seemed to turn this over. He had a way of processing information that Ethan recognized as his own, not immediately reactive, just slow and careful, which in a child sometimes looked like distance but was actually depth. Is that why you didn't want to raise your hand? Noah asked. Because of before? Ethan stood back up. Come on. Marcus is probably wondering where we are. That means yes, Noah said to his sneakers, and then he tied one of them that had come undone, and they walked back through the dispersing crowd toward where they'd parked the truck, and neither of them said much for a while. The call came on Friday morning at 7:42, while Ethan was in the middle of a brake job on an aging Subaru Forester and had his hands inside a wheel well and grease up to his wrists. Marcus came to the bay door. Phone call. Who is it? Someone named Priya Anand, calling on behalf of Hartwell Automotive. Ethan took a breath. He finished what he was doing. He didn't put things down in the middle, set the caliper down on the bench, stripped off one glove, and took the phone Marcus was holding out. Mr. Carter? The voice was professionally warm. This is Priya Anand, Executive Assistant to Olivia Hartwell. Ms. Hartwell would like to invite you to a follow-up meeting at your earliest convenience. She's prepared to come to Perdido. He walked out to the front of the shop, standing in the October morning with one glove on and the phone to his ear, looking at the street. A pickup truck he recognized went by. Dale something, from out near the Canyon Road, whose wife's Camry had been in last month. When? He asked. Saturday morning, if that works. She's flexible on the time. Saturday. Noah had Little League in the morning, the late-season makeup game, the one he'd been specifically told would not be rescheduled again by a coach who said it with the emphasis of a man who had rescheduled it 3 times. 10 o'clock, Ethan said, here at the shop. A brief pause. At the auto shop? Yeah. Another pause. Of course. I'll let Ms. Hartwell know. Is there anything you need in advance? No, Ethan said. All right, we'll see you Saturday. He handed the phone back to Marcus, who had been leaning against the doorframe, listening with the contained interest of someone who'd decided this was none of his business and was going to stay informed about it anyway. "She's coming here?" Marcus said. "Saturday? Olivia Hartwell, Billionaire, coming to Carter's Auto. 10 o'clock. Marcus looked around at the shop. The flickering fluorescent, the oil-stained concrete floor, the pegboard with the mismatched tools, the faded calendar on the wall from an auto parts supplier, which was 2 months behind and featured a photograph of the Rocky Mountains. "I'll fix the light," Marcus said. "Don't fix the light on my account." "I've been meaning to fix it anyway." "You've been meaning to fix it for 8 months." "Well, now I have a reason." Ethan put his glove back on and went back to the Subaru. He told Noah at dinner they were eating the pasta that Ethan made on Fridays, the same pasta he'd made on Fridays for 4 years, which Noah claimed to love, and Ethan suspected Noah had simply accepted as a fundamental property of Friday, the way he'd accepted a lot of things as simply the shape of how life worked, that the shop was closed Sundays, that they did laundry on Wednesday evenings, that cartoons were for Saturday mornings and not school nights, that some conversations happened and some didn't. "She's coming here," Noah said. "To the shop?" "Yeah." "Why the shop?" "Because it's where I work." "You could have met at a restaurant." "I could have," Ethan agreed. Noah twirled pasta on his fork with more concentration than the operation required. "You want her on your territory," he said. Ethan looked at his son. "Where did you hear that?" "I read." "What do you read?" "Things." Noah shrugged. "It's a negotiation tactic. You pick the location where you're most comfortable." "I just told her the shop because it was convenient." Noah looked at him with the expression of someone who did not entirely believe this, but had decided not to push it. "Is she going to offer you a job?" he asked. "I don't know what she's going to do." "Would you take it? A job?" Ethan set his fork down. This was the question he'd been not answering for himself since Thursday afternoon, and the fact that his 9-year-old had arrived at it over pasta on a Friday was both unsurprising and slightly wearying. "I don't know," he said, and this time it was simply true, without the evasion of the other times he'd said it. He genuinely did not know. He'd spent 4 years building a life in Perdido that was small and manageable and entirely his own, and there was something in the smallness of it that he'd come to rely on, in the way you rely on things that have stopped being a choice and started being a fact. Carter's Auto, Marcus, Noah's school, the flickering fluorescent light, the faded calendar, the water stain on the ceiling. "Would you want to?" Noah asked. Ethan picked his fork back up. "Eat your pasta." "I'm eating." "You're interrogating me." "I'm eating and interrogating you. I'm multitasking." Noah took a bite, chewed, looked at his father. "If you went back to doing the thing you're good at," he hesitated, "the real thing, would that be bad for us?" And there it was, the thing under the question, the thing Noah had been actually asking from the beginning. Not whether Ethan would take the job or want the job, whether the job would take Ethan away. He'd had this conversation before, differently, with himself, at 2 a.m. and in the quiet before the alarm, and in the cab of his truck parked outside the shop before he went in. The version Noah was asking was different, more direct, more honest. "No," Ethan said. "Whatever happens, it wouldn't be bad for us." Noah looked at him for a long moment, assessing, the way he did when he was deciding whether to believe something. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay? I believe you." A pause. "Also, the pasta's a little underdone." "The pasta is exactly done." "The farfalle in the corner is underdone." Ethan looked at his bowl. He considered this. "Eat around it." "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying, but Saturday arrived the way Saturdays do when you have something scheduled, too fast in the morning, too slow in the hour before the thing, and then suddenly, all at once. Marcus had fixed the fluorescent light. He'd also swept the shop floor, which gleamed under the new lighting with a cleanliness that was slightly alarming given its baseline. He'd put out a folding chair near the office door with a care that suggested he was aware of doing it and was prepared to deny it. "You swept," Ethan said. "I sweep sometimes." "Not on Saturday mornings." I'm branching out. Ethan leaned against the workbench and looked around the shop. In the morning light, good light, actual light now, without the flicker, it looked different than it usually did. Not better exactly, just more visible. The oil stains and the cluttered shelves and the tools that didn't have a place and lived on the bench in a comfortable chaos that Ethan understood and nobody else needed to. At 9:58, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Olivia Hartwell got out alone. No Priya, no driver. She was wearing jeans and a plain dark top, which Ethan suspected was her version of dressing down, and she looked at the sign above the shop door for a moment before she came in. "Carter's Auto," she said, reading it. "How long have you had this place?" 4 years. She looked around, not the appraising look of someone judging, more the cataloging look of someone who pays attention. She registered Marcus, who was behind a truck pretending to do something with a torque wrench. She registered the photos on the corkboard by the door. A couple of suppliers' business cards. A thank you note from someone written on a piece of ruled notebook paper. A drawing that Noah had done when he was 6 of what appeared to be a car, but could charitably be described as an abstract interpretation of one. She looked at Ethan. "I've been talking to my engineering team since Thursday," she said, "about your diagnosis, about the A7 sensor, the thermal expansion margin, the specific fault cascade you described." She paused. "Garrett Fossey, my lead tech, says the level of familiarity you demonstrated with the engine architecture goes beyond anything that could be acquired from publicly available documentation about the Vortex X1. Ethan waited. "He's right, isn't he?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Ethan said. "He's right." The shop was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street. Marcus had stopped pretending to do anything with the torque wrench. "Tell me," Olivia said. And Ethan, for the first time in 4 years, did. He didn't tell her everything. He told her enough: the project, the prototype phase, the problem he'd solved, the timing of when he'd left and why. He told it the way he told most things, flat and without drama, like reading a list of specifications, and Olivia listened the way she had listened in the tented area behind the stage, completely and without interruption. When he was done, the shop was still quiet. "You were on the original team," she said, "a version of the original team. It was different then. You solved the thermal expansion problem in the prototype. One version of it. The version that the current A-spine is built on." He didn't confirm this. He didn't deny it. Olivia was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. Then she said, "My company's biggest engineering achievement, the thing that's put us on the map as a real automotive force, is built on work that you did in a lab 6 years ago, and nobody who currently works for me knows your name." "Harmon got the credit," Ethan said. "That was how it worked." "That's not how it should have worked." "Maybe not. It doesn't really matter now." "It matters to me," she said, and the directness of it, no performance, no corporate language, just the statement, was something he hadn't expected from her. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and they were two people in a mechanic's shop in a small Arizona town at 10 in the morning, standing on opposite sides of something that had been waiting 6 years to become a conversation. "What do you want, Ethan?" she asked. It was the question he hadn't let himself answer. Not since Claire, not since Perdido, not since he'd decided that wanting specific things was a luxury he couldn't afford, because specific wants required a belief in the future that grief had made very difficult to sustain. He looked around the shop, at the corkboard, at the drawing Noah had done when he was 6, at the fluorescent light that was finally, after 8 months, fixed. "I don't know yet," he said, and this time, for the first time in a while, not knowing felt less like an evasion and more like the beginning of something. Olivia nodded slowly in the way of someone who understands that some answers take longer than a Saturday morning. "Then let's talk," she said. "We've got time." They talked for 2 hours. That was longer than Olivia had planned. She'd scheduled 90 minutes, which Priya had flagged as possibly too long for an initial follow-up with an unknown quantity, and Olivia had said 90 minutes was fine and she'd be back in Flagstaff by noon. She was not back in Flagstaff by noon. She was sitting on a folding chair in Carter's Auto, drinking coffee from a machine that made sounds like it was disagreeing with itself, talking to a man who answered questions in the fewest possible words and somehow made you feel, despite this, that you were getting the full picture. Marcus had left around 11. Something about picking up a part from the supplier on Route 9, which was true, and also, Ethan suspected, a diplomatic exit. The shop was quiet without him. The morning light came through the garage bay door and fell across the concrete floor in long rectangles, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking at something it probably couldn't see. Ethan had told her the broad shape of the prototype work, the team structure, the problem sets, the specific contribution he'd made to the thermal management architecture. He hadn't gone into the personal reasons for leaving. She hadn't pushed for them, which he noticed and appreciated, and so they'd stayed in the technical territory, which was cleaner and easier, and didn't require him to explain things that he had no intention of explaining to someone he'd known for 48 hours. What surprised him was how much she knew. Not the engineering specifics. She'd said clearly that she wasn't an engineer and she meant it, but the history of her own company's development. The decisions that had been made, the pivots, the moments where the project had nearly died. She knew the shape of how the Vortex X1 had come to be with the thoroughness of someone who had fought for every stage of it. The board wanted to kill it in 2021, she said. 3 times. 3 separate votes. The argument was that the development cost was too high relative to the projected market. That a car at this price point, at this performance level, was too niche. What changed their minds? I did. She said it without pride, just as a statement of fact. I spent 4 months building a case that the market wasn't niche, it was underdeveloped, that there were buyers who would pay for performance at this level if the engineering was actually at this level, and not just priced and marketed like it was. I put my credibility on the table, and I told them, if I'm wrong, you can replace me. Ethan looked at his coffee. That's a significant bet. I was right, she said. I know. I read the reviews. She looked at him. Did you follow the development? After you left? A pause. Some of it. And? He turned the coffee cup in his hands, and they'd built something better than what the prototype would have been. If I'd stayed, the team did things I wouldn't have thought to do. He said it without resentment, which was the part that seemed to surprise her. She'd been watching him for the tells of a man with a grievance, the slight tightening of the jaw, the careful neutrality that was too careful. And they weren't there. He seemed to mean what he said. That doesn't bother you? She asked. Why would it? Because the work you did made their work possible, and nobody's acknowledged that. People do anonymous good work all the time, he said. It doesn't stop being good because nobody knows about it. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck pulled into the parking lot, lingered, then left. Probably someone who'd come to drop off a car and found the shop unusually quiet. I want to acknowledge it, she said. Formally. In whatever way makes sense. Ethan set his cup down. That's not why I told you. I know it's not. That's partly why I want to. He looked at her steadily. She looked back, and he was struck, not for the first time, but more clearly now, by the thing in her that was not softness exactly, but was also not the performance of hardness that a lot of people in her position wore like armor. She was direct in a way that cost her something, you could tell. Not every exchange came easily. She had to work at the ones that mattered. What is it you actually want from this? He asked. The consulting role Priya mentioned, is that a real thing or a way of making this feel like a transaction? She didn't flinch at the bluntness. It's real. But honestly, right now I'm more interested in understanding what you want. Because I walked in here thinking I was going to make you an offer, and now I'm not sure that's the right move yet. Why not? Because you haven't decided what you want. And making someone an offer before they know what they want is how you get a yes that turns into a problem 6 months later. Ethan looked at her. That's a more patient approach than I expected. I'm not naturally patient. I've learned it's more efficient. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. Usually, they sat with that for a moment, and it was the first time the silence between them didn't have the quality of a negotiation or an interrogation or 2 people figuring out how much to reveal. It was just a pause in a conversation, which was different. I'll think about it, Ethan said. The consulting thing, what that would actually look like. That's all I'm asking. And I'll need to know the specifics before I give you an answer. The hours, the travel requirements, whether it can work around. He stopped. Your son, Olivia said. Around the shop. And Noah, yes. Both of those things can be worked around. I'm not going to tell you they can be perfectly accommodated because that would be dishonest, but they can be worked around in ways that don't require you to blow up your life. She picked up her cup and looked into it, which was empty. I don't want to blow up your life, Ethan. I want to access what's in your head. Those are different things. Sometimes they're the same thing, he said. Sometimes, she allowed. She stood up, and he walked her to the door, and they shook hands again in the parking lot with the October sun at an angle and the desert smell of the air and the distant sound of something that might have been the Little League game a few fields over. I'll have Priya send the formal terms, she said. Read them without feeling like you have to answer immediately. All right. She got into the black SUV and pulled out of the parking lot, and Ethan stood watching it go for a moment before he went back inside the shop. The folding chair was still where she'd been sitting. He picked up both coffee cups, rinsed them in the small sink in the back, and stood there for a while with his hands on the edge of the sink and the water still running, not really thinking about anything specific. Then he thought, Noah is going to ask how it went. He turned off the water and went back to work. The formal terms arrived by email Monday morning. Ethan read them at his desk in the back office before Marcus arrived, before the shop opened, in the particular quiet of a place that hasn't yet become itself for the day. It was a consulting arrangement. 15 hours per month, minimum, not 15 hours per week, 15 per month, structured around his availability, with the understanding that certain projects would require more intensive engagement during specific periods, negotiated in advance. Remote first, meaning he'd work from Perdido and only travel to Hartwell Automotive's engineering facility in Phoenix when a project specifically required his physical presence. Compensation that he read twice because the number was large enough that he wanted to be sure he'd read it correctly. He had read it correctly. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, which did not have a water stain because the office was an interior room and the water damage was in the bedroom, which was a different part of the building, he was aware that his mind was cataloging the structural specifics of his house as a displacement activity, while he processed the fact that someone wanted to pay him that much money for 15 hours a month of thinking about engines. There was a sticky note on his monitor. Noah had put it there Sunday evening after Ethan had mentioned that the offer was coming. It said, in Noah's handwriting, which was better than it used to be but still had a habit of turning slightly uphill as it went, do the thing. N. He looked at the sticky note for a while. Then he called the number at the bottom of the email, which connected to Priya, who connected him to Olivia, who picked up on the second ring. I have questions, Ethan said. Go ahead. The 15 hours. If a project requires more, how is that determined? Mutually. You'd see the scope before you agree to the engagement. Nothing gets added unilaterally. The travel requirement, maximum 2 trips to Phoenix per quarter. Probably less. Most of what we'd need from you can be done through documentation review and calls. What specifically does Hartwell need me for? I want to understand the actual work, not the job description language. A brief pause. Honestly, we're developing the second-generation A-spine for the next platform. The current architecture has a ceiling, your ceiling, as it turns out, the limits of what the original thermal management concept can support at higher power outputs. We need someone who understands the foundational design well enough to know where those limits come from and how to push past them without rebuilding from the ground up. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That's a significant project. Yes. It could take years. That's why it's a consulting arrangement and not a one-time engagement. He looked at the sticky note. I want a clause that either party can end the arrangement with 60 days' notice, no penalty. That's standard. And I want it in writing that the arrangement doesn't affect my ownership of Carter's auto or my obligations there. Of course. A pause. Is that all? One more thing. He turned in the chair. I want to be credited on whatever documentation, internal or external, comes out of this work. Not publicly, if that's complicated, but internally, it should be accurate. There was a longer pause this time, but not an uncomfortable one. More like the pause of someone who is expecting a harder ask. That's not just doable, Olivia said. It's overdue. I'll go back further than the current project. You don't have to do that. I'm doing it anyway. A beat. Was that all your questions? Yes. Then I'll have the revised terms to you by Wednesday. All right. He paused. Olivia? Yeah. The car's impressive, what you built. I want you to know that. A moment of silence that was different from the professional ones, and then she said, Thank you. And she sounded like she meant it in the way of someone who doesn't receive uncomplicated compliments often and doesn't quite know what to do with one. They hung up. He sat in the office in the early quiet, with the engine sounds beginning to drift in from the street and the coffee maker in its disagreeable cycle and the sticky note on the monitor. Then he picked up the sticky note and read it again. He stuck it back exactly where it was. Word got around Perdido the way word gets around small towns, which is to say, faster than anyone intended and with a certain amount of elaboration along the way. By Tuesday, the version of events that was circulating most widely at the Sunrise Diner went something like this. A local mechanic had fixed Olivia Hartwell's broken supercar in front of 12,000 people. She'd been so impressed that she'd offered him $1 million on the spot, he'd turned her down, and she'd shown up at his shop the next day to beg him to work for her company. This version was approximately 40% accurate, which in small-town rumor terms was actually quite good. Donna Garza called to say she'd heard he was leaving Perdido. I'm not leaving Perdido, Ethan said. Someone said Hartwell offered you a job in Phoenix. It's a consulting arrangement. I'm staying here. Well, good. A pause. I told people you weren't leaving. I know you did. Thank you, Donna. I also told them the rotor thing, about how you'd said they were fine. Why would you tell people that? Because it proved you were honest. Context. I appreciate the defense. I wasn't defending you. I was establishing a track record. There's a difference. She hung up before he could respond to this, which was consistent with how Donna operated. Marcus dealt with the increased foot traffic at the shop. People dropping in who didn't need anything done to their cars, who had heard the story and were operating on the small-town principle that the most reliable source is always the source itself. With the patience of someone who'd grown up in a place like this and understood the social function of curiosity. Guy wanted to know if you'd actually fixed the engine from 30 feet away without touching it, Marcus said on Wednesday afternoon. What did you tell him? I told him you walked up to the car and looked at the engine and told the engineers what was wrong. That's accurate. He seemed slightly disappointed. The accurate version often is. He then asked if you'd been offered $1 billion. I was offered a consulting arrangement. For how much? Marcus. Right. Marcus went back to whatever he was doing. Just so you know, the number that's currently circulating is 250,000. Per year? Per month. Ethan looked at the ceiling. That's not what it is. I know, but it's a good story. It's not a good story, it's an incorrect one. In this town, those aren't always different things. Ethan let it go because you cannot fight the information ecology of a small town. You can only exist within it and hope that the embellishments resolve themselves over time into something roughly true. He'd learned this in the first year of living in Perdido, when someone had started a rumor that the previous owner of Carter's Auto had died in the shop under suspicious circumstances, and it had taken Ethan 6 months to establish that the previous owner, Bill Hicks, was alive and retired in Tucson, and had sold the shop because his knees were bad. The revised contract from Hartwell arrived Wednesday afternoon. He read it twice. He made one small change, a specific definition of what constituted a required in-person trip, to ensure it didn't get expanded by creative interpretation, and sent it back with a note that said simply, "This works. I'll sign if the change is accepted." The change was accepted by Thursday morning. He signed it. He didn't tell anyone immediately. Not Marcus, not Donna Garza, not the various people who'd stopped by to inquire about the $1 billion offer. He put the signed document in the folder in his desk drawer and went back to the carburetor he'd been rebuilding, and he worked through the afternoon with the radio on low and the light coming in through the bay door in its usual way. And everything felt approximately like it always felt, except that something had shifted, very slightly, in the way that things shift when you've made a decision that you're not entirely sure about, but that you know, in the wordless way of certain things, is correct. He told Noah at dinner. Not pasta this time. It was a Thursday, so it was the chicken that he made on Thursdays, which was less accomplished than the pasta, but that Noah consumed without complaint because Thursdays were Thursdays, and the chicken was the chicken. I signed the contract, Ethan said. Noah looked up. With Hartwell? Yeah. So you're doing it? I'm doing it. Noah looked at his plate for a moment, then back up. Did you want to? Like, actually want to? Or did you just decide it was the right thing? Ethan considered this. Both, he said. I think both is okay. Noah seemed to consider this back. Then he nodded with the gravity of someone rendering a judgment. Yeah, he said. Both is okay. They ate in silence for a moment that was comfortable rather than empty. Is she nice? Noah asked. Olivia? Yeah. She's... He searched for the right word. She's honest. Sometimes that overlaps with nice, and sometimes it doesn't. Is she nice to you? She's fair to me. That's better. Noah ate another bite. Will you go to Phoenix a lot? A few times a year, not often. And you'll still be at the shop? The shop is mine. I'm not going anywhere. Okay. Another bite. Marcus is going to be annoying about this. Marcus is already annoying about this. He told me you were famous now. I'm not famous. He said 11,000 people saw you fix the car. I told the engineers what might be wrong with the car. They fixed it. That's not how Marcus tells it. I know. Marcus tells it the way it makes a better story. Noah was quiet for a moment, turning his fork. Is that bad? That he tells it that way? Ethan thought about it. No, he said. Not really, as long as you know what actually happened. I know, Noah said. I was there. Yeah. Ethan looked at his son. You were. Dumped. 2 weeks passed. The contract was active, which meant that Ethan was now in the official language of Hartwell Automotive's consulting agreements. A technical advisor, external, which was a title he had not mentioned to anyone and intended not to mention, because the last thing he needed was for Perdido to develop a new rumor cycle on the subject of his job title. The first piece of work Hartwell sent him was a package of documentation, the second-generation A-spine project specs, the existing thermal management data, the test results from the most recent prototype runs. He read it over 3 evenings after Noah went to bed, at the kitchen table with the light on and the house quiet, the way he'd read technical documents at 26 in a different kitchen in a different state, except that the man reading was different in the ways that years and losses make you different, more careful, less certain, more aware of the specific distance between knowing something on paper and knowing it in your hands. The problem was real. He'd seen it immediately, in the data. The current architecture had a headroom issue. Not a flaw exactly, more a boundary condition that the team had known was there, but hadn't yet found a clean path around. Above certain power outputs, the thermal behavior of the A-spine controller became nonlinear in ways that required either a total redesign of the housing or a modification to the management algorithm that would cost them response time. Neither option was good. A redesign was expensive and slow. A response time penalty in an adaptive suspension system defeated the purpose of having one. He thought about it for 2 days. He thought about it while he rebuilt a fuel system on a diesel truck, while he argued with a parts supplier on the phone, while he watched Noah practice his swing in the backyard on a Sunday afternoon. He thought about it the way he always thought about problems, which was not continuously but in intervals, setting it down and picking it back up, letting it rest in the part of his mind that worked on things without being asked. On the 3rd evening, he wrote it up. 3 pages. Not because the answer required 3 pages, but because he needed to explain his reasoning well enough that Hartwell's engineering team could follow it and verify it independently without taking his word for anything. The solution was a modification to the sensor array. Not a redesign, not an algorithm change, but a repositioning of 2 components within the existing housing that changed the thermal distribution enough to push the nonlinear threshold 22% higher. It was the kind of solution that was obvious once you saw it and invisible until you did. The kind that made engineers feel slightly stupid for not having thought of it, which he knew because he'd spent enough time in rooms full of engineers to understand how that feeling worked. He sent it to Priya, who forwarded it to the technical team. The response came back the following morning from Garrett Fossey, of all people. The email was 3 sentences. We ran the models on your proposed modification. The numbers hold. This is going to work. And then, below that, after a line break, as if it had been added as an afterthought, I owe you one, by the way, for Thursday. Ethan read the email twice. Then he closed it and went to open the shop. He didn't tell Marcus about the email. He didn't tell Noah. He tucked it away in the part of himself that stored small satisfactions. Not trophies, not evidence, just the quiet accumulation of things that had gone right, and went about his Tuesday. It was Marcus who noticed, about a week later, that something had shifted in the way Ethan moved around the shop. It wasn't dramatic. Marcus wouldn't have been able to name it precisely if asked. It was something in the pace of things, in the way Ethan talked through a problem with a car, some additional current in him that had been present before Thursday's event, but was louder now, more available. You seem different, Marcus said, on a Thursday afternoon that happened to be exactly 3 weeks after the Hartwell event. Ethan was torquing a headbolt on a Silverado and didn't look up. Different how? Like you're, I don't know, running on more cylinders. Ethan tightened the bolt and moved to the next one. That's a terrible metaphor for a mechanic to make. I stand by it. I'm fine, Marcus. I'm the same as I always am. You've been humming. Ethan stopped. He processed this. No, I haven't. You hummed this morning. I heard you. Something without a melody. That wasn't humming. That was... He stopped again. That was just noise. It was humming. Marcus leaned against the workbench. I've worked here for 2 years. You don't hum. You are categorically not a hummer, so something's different. Ethan finished the bolt sequence and straightened up. He looked at Marcus, who was watching him with the uncomplicated openness of someone who didn't have a hidden agenda and was just saying what he'd noticed. The Hartwell work is interesting, Ethan said. Yeah? It's a real problem, not a... He searched. Not a broken thing that needs fixing, an unsolved thing. There's a difference. Marcus considered this. And you like unsolved things. I used to. I'd forgotten that I did. And now you remember. And now I remember. He picked up the torque wrench and set it back on its hook. Don't make it more than it is. I'm not making it anything. You're the one who just described what it is. Ethan couldn't argue with that, so he didn't. He moved to the next car on the day's list, a brake job that was straightforward and wouldn't take long, and Marcus went back to whatever he was doing, and the shop settled back into its rhythms. But Ethan was aware, as he worked, of a sensation that he identified slowly and imprecisely as the feeling of something returning to its correct position. Not dramatic, not healing narrative dramatic, just the ordinary, almost physical sensation of something that had been slightly out of alignment shifting back, the way a joint settles when you move it the right way after favoring it too long. He did not hum. He was almost entirely sure he did not hum. 3.5 weeks after the Hartwell event, on a Monday morning in late November, Ethan was in the shop before Marcus arrived, doing a coolant flush on a Jeep that belonged to the school librarian, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. He had a policy about unknown numbers during work hours, which was that they could wait, because most unknown numbers were either robocalls or people who'd found his shop number through the website that Marcus had built, and that Ethan had never been entirely comfortable with. He picked up anyway. He couldn't have said why. Is this Ethan Carter? The voice on the other end was male, professional, with the particular cadence of someone delivering information rather than having a conversation. Who's calling? My name is Thomas Weil. I'm an investigative journalist with the Southwest Automotive Review. I'm working on a piece about the Hartwell Vortex X1 launch and the incident at the Perdido event, and I was hoping you'd be willing to speak with me. Ethan set down what he was holding. Who gave you this number? I found it through the shop listing. A pause. Mr. Carter, I want to give you the opportunity to speak for yourself before this story publishes. I think you'll want to hear what I've found. What story? I've been looking into the development history of the Vortex X1's engine architecture, specifically the prototype phase. I've spoken with several people from that team, and there are some significant questions about attribution and credit that, I'm not interested, Ethan said. A silence. Mr. Carter, the story is going to publish regardless. I'm calling you because, then publish it, Ethan said. I'm not going to be a source for a story I didn't ask for. The story involves you directly, your work. Good day, Mr. Weil. He hung up. He stood in the shop for a moment with the phone in his hand and the Jeep's coolant system draining into the catch basin with its steady sound. His pulse was slightly elevated, which annoyed him. He pressed his hand flat against the Jeep's fender, feeling the cool metal, and let his breathing slow. The journalist had found something. That meant other people were going to find it too, if they looked. The story of the Perdido event had spread further and faster than small-town news usually did, partly because of the video. Someone had filmed the whole thing, from his raised hand in the crowd to his leaning over the engine bay, and it had circulated online widely enough to generate some press coverage. He'd seen one article, sent to him by a person from his past who still had his email address, and had read the first paragraph before closing it. He had known, in a general way, that privacy was probably temporary. He'd hoped temporary meant longer than 3 weeks. He called Olivia. She picked up on the third ring, which meant she was in a meeting or something adjacent to one, because her default was second ring. A journalist called me, he said. Thomas Weil, Southwest Automotive Review. He says he's looking into the development history of the X1 prototype phase. A pause that was about 2 seconds longer than usual. When? Just now. What did you tell him? Nothing. I hung up. Good. He could hear her moving, the sound of a door closing, background noise dropping off. Ethan, I need to tell you something. The credit documentation I had the legal team prepare, the internal acknowledgement of your contribution to the prototype phase, I fast-tracked it because I said I would. And it's done. It exists. Okay? Journalists who dig into corporate development records sometimes find internal documents. Not usually, but sometimes. He processed this. So there's a possibility Weil has seen the documentation. It's a possibility. I don't know that it's likely, but I want to be honest with you about it. He leaned against the Jeep. What does the document say exactly? It identifies your contribution to the thermal management architecture in the prototype phase. It traces the lineage between that work and the current A-spine system. It acknowledges that the attribution in original project records was incomplete. Incomplete, he repeated. That's the legal language. It means inaccurate. I know what incomplete means in a legal document. Another pause. I'm sorry. I should have warned you this could happen. I moved fast because I thought it was the right thing to do, and I didn't think far enough ahead about the exposure it could create. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. The coolant was still draining. A car went by outside on the street, slowing as it passed the shop. It's fine, he said. It's not necessarily fine. If this becomes a public story, then it becomes a public story. He heard the flatness of his own voice and tried to soften it slightly. It's fine, Olivia. I'm not upset about the documentation. I asked you to do it. I know, but the exposure. I've been exposed before, he said. I'll handle it. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again her voice was different. Not softer exactly, but less managed. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why does it not bother you, the credit thing? The fact that Harmon got it and you didn't? I keep waiting for the anger and it's not there. Ethan thought about this, and he was honest with himself about it in the way he tried to be honest with himself about most things, imperfectly and only to a point. It bothered me when it happened, he said. Then other things happened, and the hierarchy of what mattered changed. Claire, she said. She'd learned the name somewhere, probably Priya, who had done a background search after Thursday, which he'd expected. Yeah, a beat. When someone dies, the scorekeeping stops, at least for a while, and by the time it starts again, you've decided what's worth keeping score on. And this isn't. This isn't. She didn't fill the silence immediately, which he'd come to understand was something she did when she was actually processing rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. I'll have our communications team monitor for the article, she said finally. If it publishes, we'll respond appropriately, and I'll give you advance notice if I hear anything. Thank you. Ethan. A pause. I'm glad you called. You said I would, he reminded her. He could hear the small sound of something that wasn't quite a laugh. "I did say that." "You were right." "I often am," she said, and this time it was clearly light, and he registered it the way he registered things that were unexpected from her, with a slight recalibration. He hung up and stood for a moment in the shop. In the quiet and the draining coolant and the smell of rubber and oil, all of it familiar down to the level of the specific, the way certain places become familiar when you've spent enough time in them. Then he checked the coolant catch basin, topped off the system, and went back to work. He thought about Weil's article. He thought about the way information moved, the video from the town square, the story circulating in Perdido, the journalist and his questions, the documentation Olivia had fast-tracked. He thought about how things that you've buried have a way of finding the surface, not through drama, but through the ordinary accumulation of people paying attention. He thought about Noah asking, at the dinner table, "Is that why you didn't want to raise your hand? Because of before?" And he thought about the answer he'd given, which was not the full answer, because the full answer was more complicated than a dinner conversation allows, and more personal than he'd been ready to offer. The full answer was that he'd been afraid, not of Olivia Hartwell, not of the crowd, not of being wrong about the engine. He'd been afraid of what it would feel like to reach back into the part of himself that he'd sealed off, the part that had been good at something before the world rearranged itself, and find out whether it was still there. It was still there. He finished the coolant flush, returned the Jeep to the lot, and went to start on the next job. The light in the shop was steady now, the fluorescent fixed and quiet, and through the open bay door the November air came in cool and clean, and Perdido was its ordinary self outside, and everything was the same as it had been a month ago except that it wasn't, and the difference was not the Hartwell contract, or the article, or the money, or any of the external things. The difference was the humming, which he definitely had not been doing, probably. The article published on a Tuesday. Ethan found out about it the way he found out about most things he wasn't looking for, through someone else. Marcus came in at 8:15 with his phone already out and the expression of a person who has information they're not sure how to deliver and has decided that fast is better than careful. "There's a piece," Marcus said. "Southwest Automotive Review, online. About you." Ethan was in the middle of logging the morning's work orders. He finished writing what he was writing before he looked up. "How bad is it?" "It's not bad exactly. It's just a lot. More than I expected." "What does it say?" Marcus set the phone on the desk and stepped back, which was the move of someone who wanted proximity to the conversation without direct responsibility for its contents. Ethan picked up the phone and read. The article was titled, "The Man Who Built the Engine: How Hartwell Automotive's Crown Jewel Was Born in a Different Lab." It was long. He scrolled without reading the number of words, but it was long, and it was thoroughly reported in the way of someone who had spent real time talking to real people. Thomas Weil had interviewed 4 former members of the original prototype team. He'd obtained what appeared to be excerpts from internal Hartwell documentation, the acknowledgement document, the one Olivia had fast-tracked, and quoted from it with precision. He'd tracked down the publication record from the prototype phase and identified Ethan's name in the technical footnotes of a document that most people in the industry had never read. The article was fair. That was the thing that surprised him most. Weil had not written a takedown of Hartwell Automotive or a hero narrative about Ethan. He'd written something more careful, a piece about how attribution worked in corporate engineering, about the gap between who built something and who got credit for it, about the specific, unremarkable way that contributions got absorbed into the institutional record and sometimes never surfaced again. Ethan's name appeared many times, but was not the center of the story. The center was the question of how this happened and whether it was unusual. The answer the article gave was, it wasn't unusual. It was very, very common. He set the phone down on the desk and sat back. "You okay?" Marcus asked. "Yeah. It's a good piece. I mean, for what it is. It is. He doesn't make you sound like a victim." "Good, because I'm not one." Marcus was quiet for a moment, leaning in the doorframe. "You knew this was coming. I knew it might come." "Does Noah know?" Ethan looked at the work orders. "Not yet. He's going to hear about it. Kids talk." "I know." So you'll tell him before school? I'll tell him tonight. Marcus nodded. He picked his phone up from the desk. Then he stopped. There's something else. At the bottom of the article. Ethan looked at him. Weil reached out to Hartwell Automotive for comment. Their statement says, Marcus found the place on his phone and read it. Hartwell Automotive acknowledges and values the foundational contributions made by Ethan Carter to the thermal management architecture underlying the Vortex X1's A-spine system. His work during the prototype phase represents a critical chapter in the development of what has become our most significant engineering achievement to date. We are proud that Mr. Carter has recently joined our team in a consulting capacity and look forward to continuing to build on his contributions. A pause. It's signed by Olivia Hartwell directly, not a PR person. Her. Ethan sat with that for a moment. She didn't have to put her name on it, Marcus said. No, Ethan agreed. She didn't. His phone, his actual phone, not Marcus's, buzzed on the desk. A text from Olivia. Article is live. Statement went out 20 minutes ago. Call me when you're ready. And then, after a gap of about 30 seconds, a second text. Take your time. He set the phone face down on the desk and went out into the shop because there were cars to work on and the day was not going to organize itself. And because he needed the specific, uncomplicated physicality of work, the weight of tools in his hands, the concrete fact of a problem with a solution, before he was ready to think clearly about the rest of it. The calls started around 10. Not many, but enough. 2 from numbers he recognized, people from the prototype phase, people he hadn't spoken to in years, whose names appearing on his screen produced a specific and somewhat disorienting sensation, like finding an old photograph in a book you haven't opened in a decade. He let them both go to voicemail and listened to the messages later, standing in the parking lot on his lunch break with a granola bar and the November air cold enough now to need a jacket. The first message was from a woman named Sandra Reyes, who'd been a materials engineer on the prototype team and whose voice was warmer than he remembered, though he recalled her as warm, so maybe memory had just compressed it. She said she was glad the story had come out, that she'd thought about him over the years and wondered how things had turned out, that if he ever wanted to have a conversation, she was in Tempe now and would buy the coffee. The second was from a man named Phil Garrett, no relation to Fosse, who'd been a project manager on the prototype, and who said, with the careful phrasing of someone who'd thought about what he wanted to say before picking up the phone, I know it's been a long time. I wanted to say that what happened with the credit wasn't right, and I was in a position to say so at the time, and I didn't. I've thought about that. I'm sorry it took this long. He stood in the parking lot listening to Phil Garrett's message twice. Not because he missed the words the first time, just because some things need the repetition to settle properly. He went back inside and ate his granola bar standing at the workbench and thought about whether apologies that arrive 6 years late are worth the same as the ones that come on time. He decided they were worth something, maybe not the same, but something. The third call was from a number he recognized but hadn't expected, James Harmon. He stared at the name on the screen for a long moment, long enough that the call rolled to voicemail. He did not listen to the voicemail that day. He would listen to it eventually, but not on Tuesday, because there was a limit to how much of the past you could receive in a single morning without it beginning to interfere with the present. He told Noah that evening. They were in the kitchen, the post-dinner portion of the day, when Noah usually did homework at the table and Ethan cleaned up, which was a household rhythm they'd developed through attrition rather than design. Noah was working on something math-related with the focused scowl of someone who found math not difficult exactly, but requiring an effort he resented. Ethan sat down across from him. Noah looked up. Because Ethan didn't usually sit down during homework time, he moved, he cleaned, he stood at the counter. Sitting meant something. There was an article today, Ethan said. Online. About the Vortex X1 and about me. Noah put his pencil down. Ethan told him what the article said. He told it the same way he told Noah most things, without filtering it into a child's version, because Noah was not a child who handled being talked down to with any patience, and also because the facts in this case were not particularly alarming, just significant. He told him about the prototype work, about the credit, about Harmon, About the document Olivia had prepared, and the journalist who had found it, and the statement Olivia had put out with her name on it. Noah listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough that Ethan noticed it and took it seriously. When Ethan finished, Noah was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then he said, "You built the thing that made the car work. I contributed to it. Several people built it. But the specific part that was your idea, the thermal thing, yeah, that part was mine. And they didn't say so. Not at the time. Now they have." Noah turned his pencil on the table, end over end. "Were you angry when it happened?" Ethan thought about being 26 and exhausted, and then 27 and grieving, and how the two things had collapsed into each other in a way that made it impossible to separate what he felt about the credit from what he felt about everything else that was ending at the same time. "I was dealing with your mother being sick," he said. "The credit thing was..." He searched. It was real. But it was a smaller thing than what was happening at home, and by the time I had the room to be angry about it, I'd already left and started over, and the anger wasn't worth carrying. Noah looked at him. "But it wasn't fair." "No, it wasn't." "Does it bother you that it took this long for anyone to say so?" Ethan took a breath. "A little," he said, which was more honest than his usual answer, and he said it because Noah was asking him something real and deserved something real back. "Yeah, a little." Noah nodded slowly, like he was confirming something he'd suspected. "The lady from Hartwell put her name on the statement." "Yeah. That means she thinks it matters, not just the document, but having her name on it." "That's how I read it." "Do you trust her?" Ethan looked at his son. In 4 years of single parenthood, he'd learned that Noah's questions were often not about what they appeared to be about, that the surface question contained another one, and that the skill was in hearing both. This one was about Olivia in its surface form. Underneath, it was about whether Ethan's judgment could be trusted, whether the man who had been quietly teaching Noah how the world worked had good enough instincts to navigate the new territory they were in. "More than I did a month ago," Ethan said. "Yeah. That's not the same as trusting her. It's the beginning of it." Noah considered this. "Okay," he said, and picked his pencil back up. He worked in silence for a moment, and then, without looking up from his math, "Kids at school are going to talk about it tomorrow." "Probably." "What do I say?" "Whatever's true," Ethan said. "You don't have to say more than that." Noah wrote something down. "And if they make it into a big deal?" "It is a big deal. You don't have to pretend it isn't." Ethan stood up and went back to the sink. "But it's our big deal. You don't have to perform it for anybody." Noah was quiet for a moment, and then, "What does perform mean in that context exactly?" "It means you don't have to act more impressed or more upset or more anything than you actually feel." "Oh." A pause. "That makes sense." Ethan dried his hands and started on the stovetop. Behind him, Noah's pencil moved across the paper with the small scratching sound of someone doing math, and the house held its usual silence around them. And nothing was dramatically different from any other Tuesday evening, except that something had been said that hadn't been said before, and it was in the air between them now, not uncomfortable, just present. He called Olivia Wednesday morning before the shop opened. She picked up on the second ring, which was her default, and he could tell from the background silence that she was somewhere quiet. Her office, or maybe a car, somewhere without the ambient noise of people. "The statement," he said. "Yeah." "You put your name on it." "I did." "You didn't have to do that. You could have put it out through communications. It would have carried the same weight, officially." "It wouldn't have carried the same weight to me," she said. "Or to you, I think." He didn't argue with that because she was right. "Thank you," he said. A pause. "You're welcome." And then, after another pause, "Are you handling it? The article, the attention?" "I'm fine. It's a fair piece." "It is. Wile's a good reporter." She said this without apparent resentment, which he thought said something about her. "My board is having feelings about the internal document becoming public, but that's a conversation I'm having with them, not you." "I didn't leak it." "I know you didn't, and I didn't either. Wile's good at finding things people don't intend to be found." A brief pause. "Did you get any calls?" A few, former team members. Anyone difficult? He thought about the third call. Harmon's name on his screen, the voicemail he still hadn't listened to. Nothing I can't handle. Let me know if that changes. I will. He was quiet for a moment, looking out the small window of the office at the parking lot, where his truck sat in its usual spot, and the November morning was gray cold and still. The second Gen A spine work, he said. The modification I sent. Fosse's team has run it 3 more times. It holds every time. They're going to need to address the secondary thermal path as well. I didn't include it in the first document because I wasn't certain, but I've been thinking about it, and there's a compounding issue at sustained high-output operation that the modification alone won't solve. She was quiet for a beat. Then, can you send that to Fosse? This afternoon. Good. Another pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted very slightly, the way it did when she was moving from the professional register to something less categorized. Ethan, I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly. Go ahead. What happened with the credit? The prototype attribution. I'm going to make sure it doesn't get buried again. Not just in internal documents. In the public record, when there's an opportunity to set it right, I'm going to take it. I can't undo what happened 6 years ago, but I can make sure the record from here forward is accurate. He looked at the window. You don't owe me that. That's not the point. The point is it's right. He thought about Phil Garrett's voicemail. The apology that was 6 years late but was still worth something. All right, he said. I appreciate that. Good. A brief pause, all business again. Send Fosse the secondary thermal path analysis. This afternoon, he said again. They hung up, and he sat in the office for another minute before he went out to open the bay doors, and the cold morning air came in, and he started the coffee maker, and the day began. The voicemail from James Harmon sat on his phone for 3 days. He was aware of it the way you're aware of a letter you haven't opened. Present, occupying a specific gravity in the back of your mind, neither forgotten nor addressed. He finished the week's work. He took Noah to the Saturday morning soccer pickup game that had started as a Little League thing and evolved, through the logic of boys who wanted to run around in November, into an informal weekly event on the school field. He drove to the hardware store and bought the materials to fix the leaning fence post. He fixed the fence post on Sunday afternoon with Noah handing him tools in the approximately right order, with the enthusiasm of someone who has been told this is good practice for the future. Is this how you learned? Noah asked on Sunday, crouching next to the post hole and watching Ethan pack the concrete. More or less. My grandfather had a lot of fences. Did he teach you about cars too? Some. Mostly I learned that in school and then from working. What kind of school? Ethan smoothed the concrete around the post base. Engineering school. Noah was quiet for a moment. You went to college. Did you think I didn't? I didn't know. You never really talked about it. Yeah. He looked at the post, checked the level. Exactly right this time. I went to college, engineering degree, then a master's. Then I worked for a while in the industry. Then I came here. Because of Mom. Because of your mom, and because of you, and because Perdido needed a mechanic, and I needed a different kind of work for a while. Noah looked at the fence post, then at his father. Is it still a while? Ethan set down the trowel. It was a good question, and it deserved a real answer. I think it became something else, he said. It stopped being temporary somewhere along the way. Is that okay? Yeah. He looked at his son, at the dark eyes that still caught him off guard sometimes. This is a real life. It's not a placeholder. Noah nodded slowly. But the Hartwell thing is also real. Both things are real. Okay. Noah picked up one of the spare tools and turned it in his hands, a small level, chrome and yellow, and looked at it the way he looked at things that interested him. Dad, the voicemail. Ethan looked at him. I could tell you haven't listened to it, Noah said. You get a kind of look. What kind of look? Like you're carrying something and you're deciding whether to set it down. He handed the level back. You should just listen to it. Ethan took the level from him. Since when do you give me advice? Since always. You just don't usually need it. He listened to the voicemail that evening, after Noah was in bed, standing in the kitchen with the lights low and the house quiet. Harmon's voice was older than he remembered. He would be 60-something now, Ethan calculated, and the voice carried the particular weight of a man who had arrived at a stage of his life where certain reckonings were unavoidable. He spoke carefully, the way people speak when they've rehearsed what they intend to say and are aware of the rehearsal. He said, "Ethan, this is James. I imagine you've seen the article. I've been thinking about what to say to you since it published, and I'm still not sure I have the right words, but I'm going to say them anyway. What happened with the attribution was wrong. I knew it was wrong when it happened, and I let it happen because it was convenient and because I told myself the project was the important thing and the record-keeping was secondary, and both of those things were rationalizations that I'm not proud of. You solved a problem that nobody else on that team could solve, and you did it without asking for recognition, which made it easier for me not to give it." A pause. Long enough that Ethan thought the message might be ending. "I heard you've been working with Hartwell. I hope it's good work. You always did your best work when the problem was real." Another pause. "I don't know if an apology from me means anything to you at this point. I suppose I'm offering it anyway and leaving it to you to decide what to do with it. Take care of yourself." The voicemail ended. Ethan set his phone on the counter and stood in the kitchen for a while. The refrigerator made its hissing sound. Outside, the desert was very quiet, the way it got on cold November nights when even the animals seemed to have decided that the sensible thing was stillness. He thought about 26-year-old Ethan Carter, working alone at 2 in the morning, solving a problem that would eventually power a car that would eventually travel 12 cities on a national tour. He thought about how that man had felt, not the specific pride, he couldn't recover that exactly, but the shape of it. The particular satisfaction of a solution arriving after enough effort. The way it had felt to write it down, hand it over, watch the test results come back positive, and understand that the thing he'd found was real. And then the months after. Claire's diagnosis, the reshaping of every priority, the leaving. The years in Perdido that had turned from provisional into actual, into the specific life he now lived with its coffee maker and its work orders and its 9-year-old son who gave advice from a crouch next to a fence post. Harmon's apology sat in the room with him. It did not resolve anything exactly. The wrong thing that had happened was still a wrong thing that had happened, and an apology 6 years later did not change its shape. But Phil Garrett had been right. There was something in the saying of it, the acknowledgement that it had been seen, even by the person who had allowed it. He picked up his phone and opened the voicemail again. He didn't replay it. He just held the phone. Then he put it down and went to bed. The following Thursday, Ethan drove to Phoenix. Not for Hartwell. Not yet. The first official consulting visit wasn't scheduled until January. He drove to Phoenix because Sandra Reyes had called back after the voicemail, and they'd spoken briefly, and she'd said she was having a small gathering at her house. People from the old team, some of whom had scattered and some of whom had stayed in the industry. And did he want to come? No pressure, just dinner. He'd said he'd think about it. He went. He left Marcus in charge of the shop, dropped Noah at the Garza house. Donna had offered without being asked, with the efficiency of someone who had seen the situation developing and prepared accordingly, and drove the 2 hours to Phoenix on a Thursday morning with the desert on both sides and the mountains ahead, and the radio on a station playing something he half recognized and didn't bother to identify. Sandra Reyes lived in a neighborhood east of downtown, in a house with a good garden that she'd clearly been working on for years. She answered the door herself, which meant she'd been watching for him. And she was exactly as he remembered, and also completely different. The way people are when you've known them at one stage of life and see them at another. "Ethan Carter," she said, "you look like you've been working outside." "I work inside," he said, "but I fixed a fence post on Sunday." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, not a welcoming guest laugh, and he relaxed slightly. There were 6 people at the dinner. He knew 4 of them from the prototype phase, knew them in the way of colleagues who'd worked intensely together for a defined period and then dispersed into their separate lives. The other 2 were people who'd come to the project later, after his time, and who knew him now only from the article and from Sandra's descriptions. Dinner was not dramatic. That was the thing he'd half expected and half dreaded. Some version of a scene, a formal acknowledgement, a moment that required him to respond with appropriate gravity. What he got instead was a meal. Good food, actual conversation, the specific pleasure of people who understand a shared technical history being able to talk about it without explaining every term. They talked about the prototype phase and about what had happened since, about the industry and about the Vortex X1 and about Hartwell. And Ethan found himself engaged in a way that had a different texture than the conversations he had in Perdido. Not better, just different. The way a muscle you haven't used in a while feels different when you use it again. At some point, the conversation turned to the credit issue. Not with drama, more the way certain topics surface at gatherings of people who share a background. Inevitably, and with the casualness that comes from having thought about it privately many times. I talked to Harmon, said a man named Victor, who'd been a simulation engineer on the team. After the article. How was that? Sandra asked. I think he's been carrying it. You know how James gets when something's in his head. Victor looked at Ethan. Did he reach you? He left a message. Did you call him back? Not yet. Victor nodded. He didn't push it. There was a general quality to the people in that room of not pushing things, which Ethan noticed and appreciated, and which made him think that the years had changed them in similar ways. The article was fair, said a woman named Bev, who'd been on the materials team with Sandra. Well did his homework. He always does, said the other person Ethan didn't know, a younger man named Dow, who now worked at a different automotive company, and had come because Sandra had invited him, and because he'd been following the Vortex X1 development closely. He broke a story about thermal management failures in battery packs 2 years ago that the industry hadn't been willing to talk about publicly. He's meticulous. He reached me first, Ethan said, before the article. What did he ask? He wanted me to be a source. But you didn't. No. Why not? Ethan thought about how to say this accurately. Because I wasn't interested in the narrative where I'm the wronged party who finally gets his due. That's a satisfying story for readers. It's not how I think about my own life. The table was quiet for a moment. Then how do you think about it? Dow asked. It was a genuine question, without challenge, from someone who was simply curious. Ethan picked up his glass. I think I did good work when I was young. I think circumstances changed in ways I didn't choose, and I left the industry and built something else. I think the work existed whether or not the record said it did. And I think now the record says it did, which is better than before, and I'm back doing something that uses the part of my brain that used to do that work. And that's... He paused. That's a reasonable outcome for a complicated set of years. The table was quiet again. Then Sandra said, a reasonable outcome for a complicated set of years, in the tone of someone repeating something to hear it better. That's either the most understated thing I've ever heard or the wisest. Probably both, Ethan said, which got a laugh from most of the table. He drove home in the dark, 2 hours back through the desert, with the stars very clear above, and the heater running, and the radio off. He thought about the people at the table, and about the years that had passed, and about how strange it was to walk back into a room from your own past and find it populated by people who had continued to live and change in your absence, who had their own complicated sets of years and their own reasonable outcomes. He was home by 10:30. The light in the front room was on, which meant Donna had brought Noah back. He let himself in to find Noah asleep on the couch with his shoes still on, tied this time, and the TV on low, showing something nature-related that had put him under. He turned off the TV. He considered waking Noah to move him to bed and decided against it, instead getting a blanket from the hall closet and laying it over him, the way he'd done when Noah was small and had fallen asleep in places that weren't his bed, which was often. He sat in the chair across from the couch for a few minutes, in the quiet of a house that was asleep. He thought about Sandra Reyes' laugh, about Victor's careful diplomacy around the Harmon question, about Dow asking how he thought about his own life, and Ethan finding to his surprise that he had an answer. He thought about Noah's sticky note, do the thing, N. He thought about Olivia's statement with her name on it. He thought about the second-gen A-spine work, the secondary thermal path analysis he'd sent to Fossey, The email back that had come in 2 hours later. This is the right call. The team's already running models. He thought about the water stain on the bedroom ceiling, which he really should patch. He thought about Claire, not with the weight that the thought used to carry, the specific gravity of loss that for a long time made it nearly impossible to hold her in his mind without everything else becoming secondary. He thought about her with the kind of directness that takes years to arrive at, where the memory is still sad but the sadness is integrated rather than overwhelming. She would have found the entire sequence of events deeply funny, he thought. The flannel shirt, the 11,000 people, the billionaire sitting in the folding chair in the shop. She had a particular laugh for things she found absurd in a good way, a low sound that started in her chest, and he could hear it if he wasn't too careful about listening. He sat in the chair until his back told him it was time to move, and then he went to bed, and the house was quiet around him the way it was quiet on the good nights, settled rather than empty, the silence of a place that has people in it. The phone call he hadn't made sat in his phone for 9 days total. He made it on a Friday evening, after the shop was closed and Marcus had gone and Noah was doing whatever Noah did in his room after dinner, which involved a great deal of intermittent music and talking to himself in a way that Ethan found both puzzling and endearing. He went out to the backyard. The fence post he'd fixed was straight and solid. The lumber pile in the corner was still a lumber pile, though he had recently moved it slightly, which counted as progress. The mesquite tree had lost most of its leaves, and the yard in the late afternoon dark was cold and ordinary and entirely his. He called Harmon's number. It rang 3 times, and then, "Ethan?" "James." A silence, not uncomfortable. More the silence of 2 people who have known each other in one way and are figuring out if they can know each other in another. "I got your message," Ethan said. "I wasn't sure you would call back." "I wasn't sure either." He sat on the back step. The concrete was cold through his jeans. "I wanted to think about what I wanted to say first." "That sounds like you." "Does it?" "You always thought before you spoke. Even at 26, most of the people on that team didn't." A pause. "What did you decide to say?" Ethan looked at the straight fence post in the cold yard. "That I accept the apology. Not because it undoes what happened, but because I think you meant it, and that matters." Harmon was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was slightly different. Not emotional exactly, but more present, the way voices get when something expected has actually arrived. "Thank you for that." "I'm not interested in being angry at you," Ethan said. "I've got a shop and a kid and now some actual interesting work again. The anger is a weight I don't want." "That's generous." "It's practical." A beat. "I'm not saying it was right, James. What happened?" "I know. But it's done, and the record is corrected now, and I'd rather have the energy for the work." "The second-gen A-spine," Harmon said. There was something in the way he said it, the voice of someone who had stayed in the industry, who still followed the developments. "I saw the Hartwell statement. I read between the lines." "Yeah." "The thermal ceiling problem?" "Yeah." Harmon made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "You know, I looked at that in 2023. I was consulting briefly for a different firm working on a similar architecture, never got past it." "It's solvable," Ethan said. "How?" And Ethan, sitting on his back step in the cold Arizona dark, in his quiet yard with its straight fence post and its pile of lumber, talked about the secondary thermal path for 20 minutes with the man who had failed to credit him 6 years ago and who was now, with the unsentimental practicality of people who genuinely love a technical problem, asking the right questions. They didn't resolve everything. Between them, there were years of wrong decisions and absent apologies and the complicated residue of a professional relationship that had been built on an imbalance. None of that disappeared in a phone call. But they talked about the work. And the work was real. And somewhere in the middle of a technical discussion about sensor array positioning and thermal distribution models, the particular weight of 9 days of an unmade call lifted enough that the conversation could be something other than the weight of it. When they were done, Harmon said, "It's good that you're back." "I never went anywhere," Ethan said. "You know what I mean." "Yeah," Ethan said. "I know what you mean." He sat on the back step after they hung up, looking at the yard in the dark. Above him, the stars were very clear, the way they got in Perdido in November when the air was cold enough to stop shimmering. Inside, he could hear Noah's music through the window. Something with a repeating guitar line, nothing Ethan recognized. He thought about the article, about Sandra's dinner table, about Olivia's statement and the document she'd created and the work she was doing to set the record straight, with the energy of someone who genuinely cared that the record was accurate rather than flattering. He thought about the moment in the town square, his hand in the air, 11,000 people, Noah's face at the barrier. He thought about Olivia asking him what he wanted, and about how he hadn't had an answer. He was starting to have one. Not complete. Not the kind of answer you could write down in 3 pages and send to an engineering team. More like the shape of something, the outline, the way you can see the structure of a thing before you can see the thing itself. He wanted the work, the real work, the unsolved problems. He wanted the shop. He wanted Friday pasta that was slightly overcooked, and Sunday fence posts and Noah handing him the approximately right tool with his left-handed grip. He wanted whatever the next years looked like, the ones that weren't a while anymore, the ones that were simply the life he was living rather than a temporary arrangement waiting for something else. He sat on the step until his back told him to move, then went inside and found Noah still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the air of someone who'd been waiting. "The call," Noah said. "Handled." "Good?" Ethan got himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "Complicated," he said. "But good." Noah looked at him for a moment with the assessing quiet of a 9-year-old who has had to become a reader of adults out of necessity. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and drank his water. "Dad," he said. "Yeah. I'm proud of you." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without performing it, the flat sincerity of someone who hadn't yet learned to make feelings complicated. Ethan looked at his son and did not say the things he was thinking, because some of them were too large for a kitchen at 9:30 on a Friday, and some of them were too personal to say out loud in any setting without considerable advance notice. He said, "Go to bed." "I'm going." Noah put his glass in the sink. He was almost at his room when he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, over his shoulder, "I knew you knew what was wrong with the car." "Yeah?" "From the second you heard the engine, I could tell." Ethan looked at him. "How?" "You went still," Noah said. "You only go still like that when you found something." He disappeared into his room, and the door clicked shut, and Ethan stood at the kitchen counter in the quiet house with his glass of water and the small weight of being known, which is its own thing entirely, separate from being seen or being credited or being right. It was, he thought, a considerable thing to have. January arrived the way January arrives in the Arizona desert, not with the dramatic cold of other places, but with a particular dryness and a light that was sharper than December's, as if the new year had decided to be clear about things. The first official consulting visit to Hartwell Automotive's Phoenix engineering facility was scheduled for the second Tuesday of the month. Ethan had been thinking about it with the same low-grade background attention he gave most things that mattered. Not obsessing, not avoiding, just aware of it in the way you're aware of a weather system moving in. He drove himself. He'd offered to drive himself, and Olivia had offered to send a car, and he'd said he had a truck and 2 working hands, and Phoenix was 2 hours, not 2 days. And she'd said fine with the particular brevity she reserved for moments when she recognized that pushing would cost more than conceding. He left at 6:30 in the morning, which was earlier than necessary but consistent with his general policy on punctuality, which was that being on time meant being early, and being early meant having a moment to stand somewhere and think before whatever was happening started happening. Noah had been dropped at school already. The school day started at 7:45, which was too early by any reasonable measure, a fact that Ethan had communicated to the school board in the small way available to him, which was mentioning it to other parents who also found it too early until they had a community of shared grievance and zero institutional change, which was how most things worked. He drove with the radio off for the first hour, the way he preferred. The desert passed on both sides, rust and sage and the occasional saguaro standing at its particular angle of mild authority. The sky was pale, and the road was mostly empty, and the truck's heater ran quietly, and the whole thing had the quality of a space between things, not yet arrived, already left. He thought about what he knew and what he was still figuring out. He knew the work. The secondary thermal path analysis he'd sent Fossey in November had generated 3 weeks of internal testing, and the results, forwarded to him in a document that was longer and more densely notated than he'd expected, had confirmed the modification. He'd read the document at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning while Noah ate cereal and periodically read headlines from the sports section of the newspaper that Ethan still received physically because he found screens difficult at breakfast. The document had been good, not perfect. There was one test condition that nagged at him, a slight variance at sustained maximum output that the team had dismissed as within tolerance, but good. Solid. The kind of good that came from competent people doing careful work. He had written back to Fossey, the variance at sustained max output in test condition 7. What's the ambient temperature range in your test environment? And Fossey had written back after a day, controlled at 68 degrees throughout. And Ethan had written, run it at 85. And Fossey had written back 2 days later with the specific energy of someone who had just found something they'd walked past several times. You were right. The variance doubles. We need to look at this. That was what he was driving toward. Not the facility, not the formal meeting, not the credentialing exercise of showing up in person. The variance at 85 degrees, the thing that wasn't resolved yet. He arrived at the Hartwell facility at 8:47. It was larger than he'd pictured from the documentation, which covered functionality but not scale. A long, low building of glass and concrete in an industrial park north of the city, with the Hartwell Automotive logo on the exterior in the same clean type as the banner that had hung across Perdito's Main Street 2 months ago. He sat in the parking lot for a moment after he turned off the truck, which was his version of the standing somewhere and thinking he'd given himself extra time for. Then he got out and went in. Garrett Fossey met him at the reception desk. This was deliberate. He'd clearly come down himself rather than sending an assistant, which Ethan noted as a gesture of something, not quite formality and not quite informality, something between them that the past 2 months of technical correspondence had built without either of them explicitly acknowledging it. Carter, Fossey said, and offered his hand. Fossey, Ethan said, and shook it. They stood for a moment in the reception area with the Hartwell logo behind them and the sound of a building doing its business around them. The test environment question, Fossey said, without preamble, because apparently they were doing it this way, which Ethan found comfortable. Yeah. We re-ran it at 85 degrees and at 92 and at 98, because once we saw the doubling, we wanted the full picture. What's the picture? It's a gradient. The variance increases with temperature in a way that becomes operationally significant above 92 ambient. In practice, that means sustained maximum output performance is compromised in any environment above 92 degrees Fahrenheit ambient, Ethan said, which is most of the country in July and August. Fossey looked at him. Yeah. So the fix is incomplete. The fix is correct for most operating conditions. For summer high-performance operation in hot climates, there's still a ceiling. Ethan thought about this. He'd been thinking about it in the background since he'd sent the temperature question. But there was a difference between thinking about something and standing in front of the person who has the full data set. Can I see the test results? He asked. That's why I met you at the door, Fossey said. Olivia found them 4 hours later in the testing data room, a space with screens on 3 walls and a long table covered in printed documents and a smell of coffee that had been made too long ago. Ethan and Fossey were standing at one of the screens, and they were not discussing the results in the way of a formal presentation. They were arguing, not badly, not with heat, the particular kind of argument that happens between people who both understand something well and disagree about the specific nature of the something. 2 people at a screen, each pointing at different parts of a graph, each making a case. She stood in the doorway for a moment without either of them noticing her, which said something about the quality of their concentration. The variance isn't in the sensor array, Ethan was saying. The sensor array is performing correctly. The variance is in the housing geometry. The housing creates a heat pocket at sustained operation that the sensors are reading accurately. The reading isn't wrong. The condition is real. If the condition is real, then modifying the housing is a manufacturing change across the entire production run, Fossey said. That's a significant cost. Or you design it out in the second generation. We're trying to solve it for the existing platform too. Then you need an active cooling element in the housing. Small, but active. Fossey looked at the graph. That adds complexity. Everything that works adds complexity. Simple systems don't do what this system needs to do. Fossey was quiet for a moment, studying the screen. An active element in that housing position would need to be integrated with the A-spine controller's power management. That's a firmware change. Coordinated with the hardware change. Yeah, that's a longer timeline. It's the right timeline, Ethan said. A shorter timeline that doesn't solve the problem isn't actually shorter. Olivia walked into the room. They both looked up, and there was the brief reorganization that happens when the person who is in charge of a place enters it. Not deference exactly, but acknowledgement. "How's it going?" she asked, to both of them, though she was reading the room and already had a sense. "We have a more complete picture of the problem," Fossey said. "And a direction for the solution," Ethan added. "That's going to require some decisions from your side about manufacturing timeline and firmware." She looked at the screen. "Show me." They showed her. Fossey presented the test data, and Ethan presented the proposed direction. And Olivia listened in the way she listened, completely, with the occasional specific question that revealed she understood more of the technical content than she generally let on. She asked about the cost implications of an active cooling element. She asked about the firmware integration timeline. She asked, at one point, what happened if they chose to solve it in the second-gen platform only and accepted the existing limitation in the current production run. "You accept a performance ceiling in high heat conditions," Ethan said, "which is a real limitation. In places like Arizona, Texas, Nevada, markets you care about for obvious reasons, sustained maximum output performance in summer will be below specification." "Below the published specification?" she asked. "Within the published specification technically, but below what the car is capable of, and below what informed buyers will eventually notice." She was quiet for a moment. "How long until informed buyers notice?" "Depends on who buys it. Performance enthusiasts who track the car, sooner. Others, maybe never." "I don't build cars for people who won't notice," she said. "We solve it." Fossey nodded, with the expression of someone who had expected this answer and had already started thinking about implementation. Ethan didn't say anything because nothing needed to be said. "I want a proposed solution document in 2 weeks, Olivia said to Fossey. "Coordinated with Carter, full timeline, cost projection, firmware integration scope." She looked at Ethan. "Can you do 2 weeks?" "I can do 10 days, he said. Fossey blinked. 10 days, Olivia said. "Good." She picked up one of the printed documents from the table, looked at it briefly, set it down. "You two want lunch? There's a place nearby that's actually edible, which is a higher bar than it sounds." "I should get back," Ethan said. "I told Marcus I'd be in by 4. Olivia looked at him. "You drove 2 hours to be here for 4 hours, and you're driving 2 hours back." "Yeah." "You could stay. The company has accommodations. Noah's school pickup is at 3:15. Marcus is covering it, but I don't like—" He stopped. "I like to be there." She looked at him for a moment with the expression she got when she was recalibrating, not impatient, not dismissive, just adjusting to information. "Of course," she said. 10 days, send the document to Fossey and copy me." "All right." She walked him out, which she hadn't done in Perdido, and they walked through the facility's main corridor with the particular unhurried pace of two people who have something to say and are deciding how to say it. "The variance problem," she said. "You knew it wasn't fully solved. You knew in November." "I thought it might not be. I wasn't certain until Fossey ran the temperature range." "But you had the instinct." "Yeah." "Why didn't you say so in November when you sent the first modification?" He thought about how to say this accurately. "Because I could have been wrong. And because bringing a partial solution is better than bringing no solution and a worry. The modification was correct for the conditions it addresses. The temperature range question was the next step." She walked in silence for a moment. "That's a specific way of thinking about problems. You don't throw everything at the wall at once." "No. Most engineers do. Most engineers are trying to look thorough," he said. "Throwing everything at the wall looks thorough. It's not always the same as being thorough." She stopped at the entrance, and he stopped too, and they stood in the winter light coming through the glass facade of the building with the parking lot beyond. I want to tell you something, she said, and her voice had the quality it got when she'd decided to say something and was committing to it rather than managing it. I've been thinking about what this arrangement is and what I want it to be. And I think I've been approaching you, as a resource, a specific expertise I needed access to, which is what a consulting arrangement is. That's what it is, Ethan said. It's what it started as, she said. I think it's something else now. He looked at her. I think you're... She stopped, visibly searching for language that wasn't corporate and wasn't oversized. I think you're someone I want to keep building things with, not just the A-spine, broader. The direction the company is going, the technical philosophy behind it, the decisions that get made about what kind of engineering we're willing to commit to. She met his eyes directly. That's a different kind of arrangement than 15 hours a month. He was quiet for a moment. What does that look like? I don't know exactly. I thought we could figure that out. Together. Yes. He looked at the parking lot, at his truck sitting where he'd left it, at the desert beyond the facility fence, pale and enormous and patient. I need to think about it, he said. I know. Not because I'm not interested. I want to be clear about that. I know, she said again. Take your time. He drove back to Perdido with the radio still off, the way he'd come. But the quality of the silence was different on the way back. Less between things, more inside something that had already started. He told Marcus in the shop the next morning. Not all of it. The version he told Marcus was the practical version. The temperature variance, the proposed solution, the scope of what the work was going to require over the next months. Marcus listened while doing something to a wheel bearing and asked the right questions at the right times, which was a quality Ethan valued in him that he'd never said directly. More hours, Marcus said when the technical part was done. Some months, yeah. The 10-day push to get the solution document out. And then implementation review, which will be sporadic but real. I can handle the shop. I know you can. That's not... Ethan paused. I want to ask you something. Marcus set down his tool and turned around, which was the move of someone who recognized a shift in conversational register and was giving it the proper attention. You've been running this place for 2 years, Ethan said, and you're good at it. Better than good. He stopped because what he was about to say was the kind of thing he didn't usually say out loud, and he needed a second to make sure he was saying it the right way. I want to make you a partner, not a full partner. Not yet, but something more than an employee. The shop should have your name in its future if you want it there. Marcus was very still. That's... He stopped, started again. That's not what I was expecting. Yeah, well, Ethan looked at the wheel bearing Marcus had set down. You've been doing a partner's work. Should be a partner's standing. I don't have money to buy in. We can structure it so you earn in over time. It's not a gift, it's an arrangement, if that matters to you. It matters to me, Marcus said immediately, with the directness of someone who knew his own values. I don't want anything I didn't earn. Then you'll earn it. It'll just be formal now. Marcus was quiet for another moment. The shop sounds filled the space between them. The specific sounds of the place they'd both been in every working day for 2 years. Why now? Marcus asked. Because things are changing, and I want you to know that the shop isn't the thing I'm leaving behind. The shop is the thing I'm keeping, and I want it in good hands when I'm not in it. You're not going anywhere. No, but I'm also going somewhere. Both things. He picked up the wheel bearing. Let me know by the end of the week. Marcus took the bearing back. He looked at it. Then he said, without looking up, end of the week. Yeah, no. Noah found out about the partnership offer the way he found out about most things in the Carter household, which was by being present and paying attention when adults assumed children were absorbed in other things. He brought it up at dinner on Thursday. You're making Marcus a partner, he said, over the chicken that was the same chicken it always was on Thursdays. Ethan looked up. Where did you hear that? You were on the phone Tuesday. I was doing homework. You weren't exactly quiet. I was in the other room. The walls in this house are not insulated, Noah said, with the authority of someone who had been conducting informal acoustic experiments for years. What does partner mean exactly? It means his name goes on the shop too. Eventually, he'll own a share of it. Does that mean you'd stop owning it? No, I still own it. I'd own more of it than him. He'd own some. Noah considered this while cutting something on his plate. Is that because you're going to be working for Hartwell more? Working with Hartwell. And yes, partly. And partly because Marcus deserves it? Mostly because Marcus deserves it. Noah looked at him with the evaluating expression. That's the right order, he said, and went back to his food. Ethan looked at his son. You understand how businesses work better than most adults I know. I read a lot. What are you reading? Things. He shrugged, then, after a pause, also Marcus told me what he hoped would happen after you talked to him. In the parking lot, when he picked me up Tuesday. Marcus told you? He was happy. He wanted to tell someone. Ethan considered the various ways Marcus had composed himself in the shop after Tuesday's conversation, the particular performance of professional calm that now made somewhat more sense. Marcus could have told me he was happy, Ethan said. He was waiting to see if you'd offer first. I did offer. I know, and then he was too happy to hide it anymore, and I was the first person he saw. Noah ate a bite. It's kind of nice that he cares that much. Yeah, Ethan said. It is. Debt. The solution document went to Fosse in 9 days. Not 10. 9. Ethan worked on it in the mornings before the shop opened, and in the evenings after Noah went to bed, at the kitchen table with the good lamp and the comfortable silence of a house that had learned to let him work. The document was 31 pages, which was longer than the 3-page first modification and shorter than the 60-page test report Fosse had sent. It covered the active cooling element design, the housing geometry modification, the firmware integration requirements, the testing protocol he'd recommend for validation, and a section at the end that Fosse hadn't asked for, but that Ethan included anyway. A note on second-generation implementation, the changes he'd recommend building into the platform from the ground up rather than retrofitting. He sent it at 6:40 on a Thursday morning before the alarm went off in Noah's room. Fosse's response arrived 4 hours later. This is comprehensive. The team's already fighting over who gets to own which piece. I mean that as a compliment. Call me when you're free. He called Fosse at lunch, standing in the parking lot the way he always took calls he wanted to have properly. The firmware integration section, Fosse said immediately. That's the complicated piece. I know. Our firmware team is good, but they're going to need you to walk them through the logic of the integration protocol. Can you do a call with them? When? Next week? Tuesday afternoon. I'll set it up. They talked for 20 minutes about implementation specifics, and at the end of the call, Fosse said, with the particular casualness of someone saying something that is not casual at all. You know, for what it's worth, I told Olivia back in October after the Perdido thing that whoever that guy was, she should find a way to keep him. I didn't know then what your background was. I just knew from watching you work for about 11 minutes that you saw things differently than anyone else I'd worked with. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You told her that after 11 minutes. I told her that. She'd already decided, I think. But I told her. Why are you telling me now? Because I wanted you to know it wasn't just about the credit or the history. It's about how you think. A pause. The team has started calling it Carter logic. The thing you do where you follow the problem backward from the symptom instead of forward from the system. That's just diagnosis, Ethan said. It's what good mechanics do. Maybe. But good engineers usually forget it. Ethan leaned against the truck, looking at the street. A car he recognized went by. One of the Garza grandkids driving the old Civic that had been in the shop twice in the past year. He raised a hand. The kid waved back without slowing, the wave of someone who waves without knowing why. Carter logic, he said. It's a compliment, Fosse said. Just so we're clear. I know it is, Ethan said. He told Olivia yes in February. Not by phone. In person, which he'd driven to Phoenix for again. This time for the firmware team call that had become 2 calls, and then a half-day in-person working session that had been scheduled for a Tuesday and run until 6 in the evening, because the problem was interesting and the team was good and nobody had noticed the time until Ethan checked his phone and realized he needed to call Marcus about pickup. After the team had cleared out, he and Olivia sat in the conference room with the remains of a working session around them. Marked up printouts, cold coffee, the digital whiteboard covered in diagrams that someone would photograph and clean up tomorrow. "The firmware team is good," he said. "They're very good. And they're energized by this project in a way I haven't seen in a while. The problem's worth being energized by. That helps." She looked at the whiteboard. "Carter logic. Fossey told you. Fossey tells me things." A small pause. "It started because of how you diagnosed the car in October. The backward from symptom method. The team's been applying it to other systems and finding things they'd walked past for months. They were probably going to find them anyway. Maybe. But they're finding them now." She looked at him. "The broader arrangement I mentioned in January. Have you thought about it?" "Yeah." "And?" He'd thought about it the way he'd thought about the A-spine problem, and the fence post and the partnership offer and everything else that mattered. In intervals, setting it down and picking it up, letting it sit in the part of his mind that worked on things without being asked. He'd thought about what it would require and what it would give and what it would cost, and whether the costs were the right kind, the kind that come from things worth doing rather than things you're afraid to refuse. "I want it structured carefully," he said. "The hours are real, not aspirational. If the scope expands, we renegotiate explicitly, not by drift." "Agreed. I want final say on what engagements I take on, not approval required final say. If something doesn't fit, I say no, and that's the conversation." "Agreed. And I want it in writing that Perdido is my base. I'm not relocating. I'm not moving the shop. Any expectation that those things are negotiable down the road, I need to know now." She met his eyes. "Perdido is your base. That's not negotiable from my side either. Honestly, I'd rather you stayed there." "Why?" She thought about how to say it. "Because the shop and your son and that town are part of what makes you think the way you think. I'm not interested in turning you into a corporate engineer. I already have those." A pause. "I want the Carter logic, which means I want the conditions that produce it." He looked at her for a moment. She was 30 years old, and she had been running a billion-dollar company for 6 years, and she had looked at him from the very beginning with the directness of someone who knew what they were seeing. He'd found it uncomfortable at first. He found it less so now. "All right," he said. "All right," meaning yes? "All right," meaning yes. She nodded, the short, clean nod that closed things rather than opened them. "Good." She picked up a pen from the table and looked at the whiteboard diagram. "The active cooling element placement. Not tonight," he said. "I have to drive back." "Right." She set the pen down, and then with the careful informality of someone who didn't do informal easily, "Thank you, Ethan." "For the consulting?" "For October," she said. "For raising your hand." He looked at her. "My son talked me into it." "I know. I've been thinking about that." She was quiet for a moment. "Bring him by sometime. To the facility. Kids who think the way he thinks should see what this work looks like from the inside." He stood up and started collecting his things. He'd take the place apart. "Good. That's what it's there for." He left at 6:45, which meant he was back in Perdido by 9, which meant Noah was already in bed but not yet asleep, and Ethan could see the light under his door when he came in. He knocked. "Yeah," Noah said. He opened the door. Noah was reading, which he did until later than he was supposed to, but Ethan had stopped enforcing the lights out time with any real conviction because Noah was a reader and Ethan was not in a position to argue that reading was the wrong use of extra time. "Good trip?" Noah asked. "Good trip." "Did you say yes?" Ethan leaned in the doorframe. "How do you always know?" "You texted Marcus to say you'd be back by 9. You only do that when you're not in a hurry, and you're only not in a hurry when something went well." Ethan looked at his son. "You're going to be a very difficult adult." "I'm going to be a great adult," Noah said, without apparent uncertainty about this. "Yeah," Ethan said. "You probably are." He reached for the door. "Get some sleep." "Dad?" "Yeah." "I'm glad you're happy." He stood in the doorframe with his hand on the wood and the light from Noah's room falling across the hallway floor. He thought about all the things he could say and all the things that didn't need to be said because they were visible in how he came through the door at 9 o'clock on a February night, not carrying the weight that he used to carry, not sealed against the day the way he used to be. "Me too," he said. "Sleep." He pulled the door to and went to make himself a cup of something and sit in the quiet for a while, the way he did on evenings when there was no urgency and no problem outstanding and the house was its good self around him. What? March came, then April. The active cooling solution cleared its first full validation test cycle on a day in late March when the Phoenix ambient temperature hit 87 degrees, which was both unseasonably warm for March and, as Fosse noted in the email that came with the results, almost perfectly timed to validate the temperature range correction they'd spent 4 months building. The results were clean. Not perfect. There was one edge case condition at maximum sustained output above 95 degrees that showed a variance of 1.3%, which was within tolerance, but which Ethan noted in his response and said he'd revisit. Fosse wrote back, "The team's calling that a future NOAA problem," which made Ethan stare at the screen for a moment before he realized it was a reference to second-generation development, not his actual son, and then he sat with the coincidence of that for a moment and didn't quite smile and went back to work. The partnership papers for Carter's Auto were signed on a Thursday in early April, in Ethan's small back office with Marcus sitting across the desk from him and a notary from the law office on Perdito's main street who had notarized various documents for half the town and treated this one with the same unflappable efficiency she brought to all of them. Marcus signed his name with the particular deliberateness of someone who understood the weight of what they were signing and wanted to give it the right pace. When it was done and the notary had gone, they sat in the office for a moment with the papers between them. "We should probably do something to mark this," Marcus said. "I don't know what." "Coffee," Ethan said. "We have coffee every day." "Then it'll be a good day to have it." Marcus laughed, which was a real laugh, and Ethan poured the coffee from the machine that still sounded like a small animal in distress, and they drank it standing in the office the way they always drank it, and it was not ceremonial and was also, in the specific way of ordinary things that carry weight, completely sufficient. "Thank you," Marcus said when the coffee was gone. "You earned it." "I know, but still." "Yeah," Ethan said. "Still." Great. In May, Olivia Hartwell brought 2 members of her engineering leadership team to Perdito. Not for the shop, for the canyon. She'd asked, in March, whether there was somewhere in the area worth seeing, and Ethan had said the canyon road was worth it if you had time, and she'd filed that away in the way she filed things and then called in May and asked if that was an open invitation or a figure of speech. He'd said it was open. They drove out on a Saturday morning, Ethan and Noah in the truck, Olivia and her 2 engineers in a rental that was conspicuously not a Hartwell vehicle, which Ethan noticed without commenting on. The canyon road took them up into the mesa country east of Perdito, and the desert gave way to pinon pine and then to rock formations that turned from red to orange to something between the two that had no accurate name. Noah had appointed himself guide, which nobody had asked him to do and nobody objected to. "The formation on the left is called the ear," he said, from the back seat of the truck, addressing the general vicinity as if conducting a tour. "People call it that because of the shape, but actually, if you look at it straight on, it looks more like a thumb. But ear is what it's called." "Who decided to call it the ear?" One of the engineers, a woman named Jess who'd been on the firmware team and who had the easy manner of someone comfortable being interested in everything, asked from the other car via the open windows at a stop. "I don't know," Noah said. "Someone a long time ago who apparently thought it looked like an ear." "Democracy of perception," Jess said. "What does that mean?" "It means enough people agreed that it looked like an ear that the name stuck." Noah considered this. "I still think it looks like a thumb." They parked at the canyon overlook and stood at the railing with the morning air cold and clean, and the canyon dropping away below them in layers of red and brown, and the far below glint of the dry riverbed. The scale of it was the kind of thing that adjusted your sense of proportion involuntarily. You couldn't stand at the edge of it and feel exactly the same size you'd felt before. Olivia stood at the railing without talking, and Ethan stood near her, and they looked at the canyon together in the comfortable silence of people who didn't need to fill space. "Okay," she said after a while. "I understand why you live here." "Yeah. I don't know that I could, but I understand why you do." He looked at her. She was still looking at the canyon, and her face in the morning light had the quality it got when she let the management down, when she wasn't running anything and was just a person looking at something larger than herself. It was a different face than the one she wore in conference rooms, and it was, he thought, the more interesting one. "You could visit," he said, "as a person, not as Hartwell Automotive." She glanced at him. "Is there a distinction?" "Probably. Haven't figured it out fully." The corner of her mouth moved. "An ongoing project." "Most interesting things are." She looked back at the canyon. Somewhere behind them, Noah was explaining something at length to Jess, who was asking follow-up questions with what appeared to be genuine interest, and the other engineer had climbed a small rock formation and was taking photographs with the focused absorption of someone discovering they're better at enjoying themselves than they'd thought. "The second-gen platform," Olivia said. "I want to start the conversation about your role in the foundation design, not consulting, actually being part of the design team for the architecture, from the ground up." Ethan looked at the canyon. The sun had moved enough that the far wall was fully lit now, the colors more distinct, the layers more readable. "That's a bigger commitment," he said. "I know. And it would need to be structured differently, real collaborative credit from the beginning." "From the beginning," she said. "Your name in the project documentation, the design credits, everything. That's not negotiable for me." He was quiet for a moment, not because he was uncertain, more because certain things deserved the pause that confirmed they were being taken seriously. "Let's have that conversation," he said, "properly, with Fosse in the room and the technical scope defined." "Next month." "Next month," he agreed. Noah had arrived at the railing, slightly out of breath from whatever topographical negotiation he'd been conducting. "Jess wants to know if you're going to help design the next vortex," he said to his father without preamble. "I told her I didn't know." Ethan looked at his son. At the canyon behind him, enormous and red and patient. At Olivia, who was watching him with the expression she had when she already knew the answer to something and was waiting for the person to catch up. "You told her you didn't know," Ethan said. "Because I don't," Noah said. "Do you?" Ethan put his hand on his son's shoulder, briefly, the way he sometimes did when a gesture was the right size and words were too much. "Getting there," he said. "The thing about a life is that it doesn't announce its turning points while they're happening. It gives you a moment, a hand raised in a crowd, a knock on a door, a phone call in a parking lot. And you don't know yet whether that moment is a turning point or just a moment. You find out later, looking back, when the distance makes the shape visible. Ethan Carter would not have told you, in October, that the Vortex X1 failing in front of 11,000 people was the beginning of something. He would have told you he heard an engine and knew what was wrong with it, and he raised his hand because his son asked him to, and that was the whole of it. He would have been partly right. That was the whole of the moment. The rest of it was the accumulation of what came after. The drive to Phoenix, the signed papers, the Saturday morning at the canyon, the 31-page document that a firmware team was still working through in April, the partnership, the conversations that happened over coffee in a shop with a fixed fluorescent light, the phone calls taken in parking lots, the sticky note on a monitor that said, "Do the thing." N. None of it was a clean story. There was no single moment where the past resolved itself and the future became clear. Harmon's apology did not erase what had happened, and the attribution document did not unerase the years when the record had been wrong, and signing the Hartwell contract did not make Ethan Carter whole in the way of a narrative that requires people to be broken before they can be fixed. He hadn't been broken. He'd been living in Perdido, running a shop, raising a boy with his mother's eyes, fixing things that needed fixing, being good at the work the way he'd always been good at the work. The flannel shirt. The 11,000 people. The engine catching on the first try. What it was, if it was anything, was a correction. A small, real adjustment. The kind you make when you've been walking at a slight angle for so long you've stopped noticing it, and someone points out the horizon, and you shift, and the difference is not dramatic, but it's permanent. Marcus Webb's name went on Carter's auto in June. not on the sign. They'd decided against changing the sign because Carter's Auto was what people called it and what they expected. And Marcus had said correctly that brand recognition was a real thing, and he didn't need his name on the building to know the place was partly his. What his name went on was the legal documents, the bank accounts, the insurance, the small and unglamorous infrastructure of ownership. He'd stared at his name on the first legal document for a moment before signing it, and Ethan had let him stare. Noah turned 10 in June. He wanted a birthday at the canyon, which they did. A small group, the Garza family, Marcus, a handful of kids from school, sandwiches and a cake that Ethan had made himself, and that was not particularly beautiful, but that was by consensus good. Ethan stood at the railing with the canyon below and watched his son in the middle of a group of children doing whatever children do at the edge of something enormous, which appeared to involve a great deal of arguing about who could see the farthest and a side argument about whether the formation across the canyon looked more like a thumb or an ear. The ear faction was winning, but narrowly. It was a good day, not a perfect day. Noah had a brief and fierce argument with one of his friends about something that nobody fully understood, and the cake came out slightly lopsided because Ethan had forgotten to level the layers, and the drive home was too long for a full car of tired people. It was a good day the way most good days are, imperfect and crowded and quick and real. In July, Ethan drove to Phoenix for the first formal meeting about the second-generation platform. He sat at a table with Fosse and 4 other engineers, and Olivia at the head of the room and a blank whiteboard, and the conversation was not yet about solutions. It was about problems, the known ones and the suspected ones, the architecture decisions that would determine what would be possible and what wouldn't, the fundamental choices that go into a thing before it exists. He'd brought a notebook. He hadn't brought a notebook to a meeting in years, because at Carter's Auto the thinking happened in his hands and not on paper. But this was different thinking, the early stage kind, the kind that needed to be written down before it could be shaped. He opened the notebook. Fosse was talking. He listened and wrote. At some point, Olivia looked across the table at him, and he was mid-sentence in something he was writing, and she didn't say anything, but her expression was the expression of someone who is seeing what they came to see. He didn't look up. He was writing. That was how it started. The next thing, the bigger thing, the work that would take years and produce something that didn't exist yet, and that he would help bring into existence from the beginning, with his name on it from the beginning, with his son knowing the whole of it from the beginning. Not all at once. The way things actually happen, one decision, then another, until the accumulation of decisions becomes a direction, and the direction becomes a life, and the life becomes the thing you look back on and recognize as your own. He drove home that evening with the window down and the July heat and the desert and the stars coming up on the eastern horizon. He thought about nothing specific, which was different from not thinking. It was the particular mental state of someone who has done satisfying work and is allowing the day to settle. He pulled into the driveway at 9:15. The light in Noah's room was on. Through the window, the thin line of it under the door, the evidence of a boy reading past when he should be sleeping. He sat in the truck for a moment in the dark. He thought about the water stain on the bedroom ceiling that he kept meaning to patch. He was going to patch it this weekend. He'd bought the materials in March, and they were in the garage, and this was the weekend. He thought about the lumber pile in the backyard, which was still a lumber pile. The raised garden bed was going to be a fall project. He'd told Noah this, and Noah had written it on the calendar in the kitchen with his slightly uphill handwriting, which meant it was now an actual commitment with a date. He thought about the swing set that he'd bought secondhand and kept meaning to replace. Noah was 10 now, on the older edge of swing sets, but he still used it sometimes. Alone in the backyard in the late afternoon, the particular private thing of a kid on a swing thinking whatever they were thinking, he'd replace it eventually. Not yet. He got out of the truck and went inside. The house was quiet and warm and his. He knocked on Noah's door. "Yeah," Noah said. He opened it. Noah lowered the book, which was something thick and clearly above grade level. "Good day?" Noah asked. "Good day." "The design meeting?" "Good start." Noah nodded. He seemed to be looking at his father with the particular attention he gave to things he was assessing, and whatever he was assessing, he appeared to find it satisfactory, because the attention softened into something that was simply looking. "You smell like Phoenix," he said. I drove back with the window down. "You always do that." "I like the air." "I know." Noah picked his book back up. "Night. Night." Ethan reached for the door. "Noah." "Yeah." "The swing set. You still use it?" "Sometimes." "I'm going to replace it. When you're ready." Noah looked at him over the top of the book. "I'm not ready yet." "Then when you are." "Yeah," Noah said. "When I am." Ethan pulled the door closed and stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet. Then he went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water at the sink, looking out the window at the dark backyard, at the swing set just visible in the ambient light from the neighbor's yard, at the fence with its straight posts, at the lumber pile that was going to become something in the fall. The mockingbird in the mesquite tree was quiet. The house settled and ticked around him. He rinsed the glass, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. The water stain on the ceiling was there when he looked up. This weekend, he thought, this weekend. He closed his eyes, and the room was dark. And Perdito was quiet around him. And somewhere in the house, a boy was reading past bedtime. And somewhere in Phoenix, a whiteboard had the beginning of something on it. And the night was warm and still. And Ethan Carter, 32 years old, mechanic, father, engineer, the man in the flannel shirt, lay in his ordinary bed in his ordinary house and did not feel the weight he used to feel. He felt, instead, the not weight of it, the specific, real, impermanent, workable lightness of a life that was his. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was what he had.